Hello and welcome to episode 25 of Xenothesis. Today we have a special episode where we discuss a very influential and underrated film named GATTACA. I'm Michael Linka, and of course, as always, I'm joined with my co-host
Richard Acton.
Hi Richard, how are you doing?
I'm pretty good, Michael. I'm looking forward to discussing this film because it's both a good film and very interesting as a treatment of sort of hard science or hard science fiction for biology.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because when we looked for media or the media talking about science, the big science as close as possible to reality, I would say, GATTACA always appears as number one on any list. If you type in any search engine out there. So we needed to do this episode to
certainly in the biological sciences.
Yes,
right?
yes. We're talking about biological science. I mean, as we mentioned before, chemistry, physics. There are great movies out there that go really nice detail and really accurate detail into the sciences of physics and chemistry. But biology often gets, I would
short
say,
shrift.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not exactly accurate as it should be. So, but the GATTACA really gets it. I think it's that they did a fantastic job.
Absolutely. It's I mean the kind of especially the near future nature of it as well is quite I think it's relevant for how well it stands up, because like predicting the future in biology is extremely difficult, like more so than in most other fields, because it's a science of complexity, and that is inherently unpredictable in a way that sciences that rely on kind of like more fundamental laws,
Yes.
There's some, like, take Moore's law in computing and stuff, right? You can kind of extrapolate for a pretty consistent period of time the sort of stuff that's going on. I mean, you can kind of do that for some stuff, like the rate of sequencing in biology, but even then, it's like the understanding that arises from that is thoroughly non-linear. So being able to do something that's going to stand up well is threading a difficult needle.
Absolutely. And to be honest, to quote a friend of mine who's a chemist, he said while working on biology, and he was working cell culture, he said he absolutely hated it because it never did exactly what he wanted it to do. So there you go. This is the biology for you. You never know what's going to happen. And when it happens, it's always outside of your predictions. So
oftentimes.
But often enough to say, I would say that it can make some sleepless nights for you. Cause sleepless nights.
Oh yeah. That's just the inherent challenge of dealing with complex systems is there are so many variables. So oftentimes there's something that you haven't quite managed to account for when you're thinking about it. So it comes and bites you in the arse.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think this is where GATTACA really shines, because although as biology goes, they don't really go into that much like super sci-fi, I would say, but a movie that was released in 1997, the prediction of the sequencing technology and the abilities of what we have nowadays is really accurate. So I would say, honestly, the movie is something to watch. I would recommend everyone who's listening to the podcast that before you continue with listening to us, stop, go watch GATTACA, and then come back and listen to our podcast. Because I think, well, unless you like spoilers, because we will talk about the plot, but I would rather people to watch it first and then appreciate the movie with us together while we're having this conversation. You're listening to the podcast.
Agreed, and it's actually a very good movie on many different fronts, as well as having some good science content, right? Cinematographically and all the rest of it, right? It's a great
absolutely.
It's a great narrative. It's a good. It's got an amazing cast. On many different dimensions, it's actually a very good film.
Yes, the topics that are tackled, the ideas. I think absolutely go watch it first, and then come back to listen to us. So, Mark, let's say 6 minutes of our recording now. Let's stop there and then just go back come back from here.
Yes.
But on that note, we'll start our sort of summary plot and then discussion on the movie. As mentioned earlier, the movie was released in 1997, 24th of October, I believe.
Yes, I was very shortly about to turn 5 at that point in time.
I see. 5. Yeah, actually, to be honest, I was already 5 at the time. For me, few more months before I would be 6. The director was Andrew Niccol, who was writer of The Truman Show, another fantastic movie, although not like science fiction, but I would say also highly recommend if you haven't seen it.
It's kind of arguably somewhat sci-fi.
Yeah, but it's more about the media aspect of sci-fi instead of biology or chemistry or biophysics, I would say.
I think this was his, if I'm not mistaken, his directorial debut.
Oh, was it?
I think so, yeah.
Honestly, it's probably the best movie to have a debut with, but my perception is now skewed after watching the movie, obviously, so I can't be objective on this. But what is Gattaca? Well, it's a dystopian science fiction film. As Wikipedia sort of describes it, it's a film that presents a biopunk vision of future society driven by eugenics, where potential children are conceived through genetic selection to ensure they possess the best hereditary traits of their parents. In fact, some cases go even further by modifying the embryos with genes that even their parents do not possess, to just give them extra edge. And the movie just goes around the society of where there are people who are genetically better than others.
But it does the thing that I think is more interesting of somewhat dystopian fiction, in that it's not purely dystopian, right? It's one of those dystopias that has a strange appeal in some aspects of it, right? It's not the kind of like the eugenics you see in the film is not like the state enforced eugenics, right? It's the kind of more capitalist version, right? Yes. It's the people are choosing to do this in order to compete more effectively, or in order to have their children be able to compete more effectively.
Absolutely, that's correct.
It's more, it's a question of like social status and sort of competing in that rat race, rather than it is like a kind of overbearing state demanding that people be genetically engineered. So it has that aspect to it, and of course, it's also the genetic modifications that are being done are good in many ways. They're curing a lot of diseases. They're alleviating a lot of suffering. Absolutely. But this, as in all things, there are unintended consequences, and it can be handled more or less well. And this is kind of a representation of one of the particular ways in which it can be mishandled.
Yes, the movie tackles this issue where, although it's illegal to discriminate against your genes, every company out there will always find a way to check what genome you have, and then whether you're suitable for the position you're applying or not. So it's a very interesting and compelling argument, I would say, of why laws like that are so crucial, and that they have to be, they have enforced. To be enforced. Yes, that's the word I was looking for. Enforced to ensure that, because quite frankly, I feel like the movie hits home very close. Like it's really not so far future, and we need to really start thinking about these type of things, because it can be it'll be bad if once the technology is good enough to do what they did in the movie. But anyway, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves about the plot. I think we'll get there. We really will get there.
Yeah.
So we have Richard mentioned earlier about the style, the cast. Like it was really good cast, and it was. We had Ethan Hawke, we had Uma Thurman with Jude Law, Lauren Dean, Ernest Borgnine, Gore Vidal, and Alan Arkin as the supplement, as the second as a side characters, right? So it was a really good cast, and in general they did a fantastic job.
Yeah, especially like Ernest Borgnine and Gore Vidal are kind of like acting legends, and they have like these relatively minor characters in the the kind of background of the film. It's quite interesting. The casting was done by Francine Maisler, for anyone interested in the kind of cinema trivia. But there's a few other interesting little bits about the cast in this movie. And one of them is that Ethan Hawke and Uma Thurman met on this film and then got married. Stayed that way for 7 years. Quite good for Hollywood.
Yeah, quite good for Hollywood.
They had a daughter together. So interesting little bit of sort of set trivia. This was also one of Jude Law's, I think it was his first American film. He'd mostly been in theatre in the UK before that. So it's kind of not a breakout role as such, but one of his early American cinema roles. Mm-hmm. A couple of the other minor characters that people might know from other things. Tony Shalhoub is the kind of black market gene broker.
I recognize
Blair Underwood is the...
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Blair Underwood is the geneticist, who we see when they're kind of creating Vincent's brother. We've got Dean Norris, Hank Schrader from Breaking Bad, who has this tiny little bit part. A lot of people don't even notice he's there.
Really? I did not notice it, even though I didn't read the notes properly and I didn't realize that who he was. Wow, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So he has a little tiny part where, like, Eugene just, like, yells at him for being a pushy cop. It's funny.
Yes.
And then there's the kind of main doctor at Gattaca is played by Xander Berkeley. I think he's known from quite well in recent years. I think he might be in The Walking Dead. I don't watch that, so I don't know, but something like that. And then Danny DeVito was one of the producers.
To be honest, I think Danny DeVito produced a lot of movies, really influential movies, but not many people realize that.
Yeah, he's kind of really big as a producer these days.
It's awesome. I mean, the cast is amazing, and I feel like they did a fantastic job, honestly. Do you want to talk about the names?
Oh, sure, yeah. So there's a couple of little points that I think are worth drawing out about the naming of the characters. So Vincent, who is the sort of primary protagonist in the film, the word Vincent comes from vincere in Latin, which is to overcome. And his last name is Freeman. And the sort of themes that are explored with his character very much reflect that overcoming and freedom of choice against predestination that very well fits thematically. And then, of course, there's Irene Cassini. So Cassini is comes from Giovanni Domenico Cassini, who discovered the so 4 of the satellites of Saturn, and the Cassini mission launched Saturn. Actually, it launched in '97 when the film was released to study Saturn, and it landed the Huygens probe on Titan, and Titan is, of course, the destination that they're traveling to in this film. So we've got Irene named for the destination that they're trying to get to, and she's very much striving to be involved in this and very driven to be on that mission. And as is Vincent, so it fits quite well that she's called Irene Cassini. And actually, the Cassini probe intentionally crashed into Saturn in 2017, 10 years later.
I see. No, it makes sense. I've recognized the surname, but I never made the connection. I didn't realize that it was nice. That's a really nice reference there.
Yeah, it's a good connection. There's a lot of there's so many things in this film where it's just there's a little detail that's like, oh, that actually has all of these very nice connections to everything else that they've put in the film. It's very well done. And then there's Eugene, which that's the middle name of one of the other main characters in this, and of course, you can tell from the similarity it relates to eugenics. And U as in kind of true or pure, and then genos. I forget exactly what the translation of that is. It's it fits with his character, right? He's the one who is sort of engineered to be the perfect sort of Ubermensch human being. He's the ideal of this, and his middle name is Eugene. He has good genes. That's the a very apt description of the character in the naming.
Absolutely. It's I see. There's a lot of details like that, and the fact that the movie has been nominated for a large number of awards, Academy Awards, Golden Globes, Hugo Awards. It also won several others, so it's a highly appreciated and
so the critical reception, as you say, was good.
But the box office though,
yeah, it didn't do great at the box office. I think it was fifth on its opening weekend and made in its box office run $12.5 million against a reported budget of $36 million. So yeah, I mean, there were a few other, I can't remember exactly what, there were a few other sort of moderately popular films out on the same opening weekend, but there were also a few not so great ones that ended up behind. But it's kind of, it's been a bit of a slow burn, I think. I don't know whether or not they've made back their full budget, but I imagine they probably have done on subsequent sales of VHS and DVD and stuff, because people show this a lot in biology classes.
Yes. I guess they had to make it some. Probably in long term, they probably made it back. But it's
became
really
a bit of a cult classic.
It's surprising, but then again, it depends on what was in the cinema at the time and what something could have overshadowed it in the popularity, I would say.
No, I looked it up when I was doing the research, and I don't remember what else was out this weekend, but there were a couple of things I was like, okay, yeah, maybe that could knock it off the top spot, understandably, but then it was behind a couple of other ones where I was like, not so much.
Not so much. Then again, who knows? Maybe some of the more popular movies were just, typical action thrillers or something like that. So
yeah, I mean, it's I wouldn't say it's like slow paced. I mean, it's probably marginally slower than many modern movies because the pace of movies has like accelerated a lot. In recent years, it's probably the kind of thing that it would be difficult, especially at that budget, to get made now. But it's kind of it's a bit of a think piece of a film.
Yes, there's a lot of nowadays there's a lot of dialogue, a lot of things happening at the same time, just to like give people the constant action so people don't get bored. But the movie, although it's slow pace, I think it allows you to appreciate it more.
I mean, it's a very compelling film. Like it's not like you'd get. I don't think you get bored watching this. But I mean, there's a few places where they take a little bit of time on some shots and stuff that I think they might not do in a modern version of this. But it definitely adds rather than detracts from the production. And just to talk a little bit more about some stuff in the production design and some of those little things that kind of small details. There's a couple of places in the film where like spiral staircases feature as representations of you've got the DNA double helix.
Yes.
There's one that features quite prominently in Eugene's house, and there's another one that's in the office where they go to have Vincent's brother like genetically engineered. And that's actually in the local
the clinic.
Yeah, but the actual staircase is from like the Department of Work and Pensions or something in the local area where they were shooting this.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. And they kind of used that location because it had this cool spiral staircase. So there's kind of little things of just these like visual representations of kind of metaphorical connections to what's going on in the film. And like the whole aesthetic of the film is really quite interesting. It's got a very kind of high modernist feel. There's a lot of sort of clean lines, even in the cinematography. All of the shots have these kind of smooth pans and very sort of sleek curves, and the choice of filming locations, because most of it was there's a lot of on location filming. They did some stuff where they built sets that were for interiors of the locations where they filmed, modeled after them. But the main GATTACA building is the Marin County Civic Center, which was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. I think it was the last commission he had before he died, and that is. But he did the architecture, but he also did all the design work. So all of the little detail pieces, like the doors and all the kind of fixtures and fittings and stuff, were designed by him too. So it's a real everything is his design. But it's a very interesting building because it has this there's a lot of kind of concrete and and these smooth curves, and it blends into the location where it's built really nicely. But it's also it's got this kind of like I said, it's got this very high modernist, concrete, clean lines kind of a.
It's very brutal, I would say, because there's you can see very little of like greenery inside. Everything is very, I would say, clean.
It very much has that kind of the sort of functionalist, brutalist aesthetic influence, and but it also has a biologically inspired element. There's a lot of bits where it has these kind of little bits of like fractal self-similarity with kind of arches and curves that relate to one another. It's got this kind of almost Gaudi-esque biological feeling to some aspects of it, despite the fact that it still has this very kind of abstract, clean line design. But yeah, it's like the perfect spot for filming this, because it has that combination of these kind of like biological curves and the like very modernist attitudes of that fit with the whole society of genetic engineering and progress towards the future in science. And
yes.
It's got that whole package very nicely combined. And the clothing is also done in kind of a similar way. They wear these very like mid-century modern style suits. At least the valids do, like the people who have been genetically engineered and who have the kind of high status jobs. They're sort of very modernist clothing, but also quite high society, right? It's got a high culture type feature to it, and there's a few bits where they're going to kind of classical music type events and appreciating kind of like fine dining stuff in a slightly more like Baroque or classical appearing contexts. So you get that kind of like social class depicted in what they're wearing and in the sorts of culture that they experience. And then you've got that kind of contrasted with the invalids, who are always wearing kind of like drab and khaki kind of stuff, and more like jumpsuits and uniforms.
Yes.
And they tend to, a lot of imagery of like trash and garbage, and they tend to be picking up other people's. It's all kind of like the social divide is very clearly illustrated in the clothing and the coloring and the contexts. You also see them in the kind of less high culture contexts, right? More in the more brutalist looking architecture, the more kind of square and clean line, and the less like less curved and the less Baroque.
It really reminds of this, I would say, 80s, 70s, 80s design of buildings that were very square, just concrete, not many windows. It's a really brutal design of buildings, and I don't know. It feels like
the other sort of interesting building is the CLA building. That's I forget which. It's a university in California, where that one has that sort of pointed triangular roof, and that's got a lot more of the sort of square, straight line stuff. And I think that might be where Vincent is living before, as an invalid, before he kind of takes on Eugene's identity.
Yep, but notice that the future, in all the dystopian future, there's a bit of brightness out there with the use of electric cars by people,
Yeah, it's quite well done actually. They have a lot of very classic kind of again like mid-century sort of 50s, 60s cars. There's this gorgeous Citroen convertible that Irene drives, but they kind of overlay an electric motor whir in place of like an engine sound whenever they're driving around in these things. I know that they have that very kind of distinctive like steel bodywork that you get in those older cars. Very nice.
I would say I would like to see those old sort of beautiful cars, but with like electric engines at some point. That'd be amazing.
Yeah, I mean, the trouble is that the crumple zones don't work nearly so well on the like metal bodywork, and it's so much heavier, so it's just not efficient. But it looks amazing, so it's like damn it! I wish it worked better because it looks so good. But
I guess remakes or remastered versions of those cars in the lighter
something
frames.
like that.
Yeah,
I don't know, but it's a fun aesthetic. The score is also really good, very compelling. composed by Michael Nyman.
It's very distinguished. Like when you hear it, you always associate it with the movie. So it's a fantastic piece of music.
And it's a really kind of complicated layering of stuff in there, because it has this very kind of ominous tone a lot of the time.
Yes.
It's quite sort of threatening. There's a sort of constant sense of anxiety that is induced by this music, but it also has this kind of I don't really have the right musical vocabulary to describe this, but it has this sort of upward trending component to it. It feels there's threads in it that have this kind of uplifting, forward looking, overcoming kind of a theme to them. I don't know how to articulate that as how that's conveyed in the music, but it has this complexity.
It matches it matches what happens in the movie. The hope that Vincent has to overcome those genetic, deformities, or not deformities, but more of imperfections, limitations that are possessed, that he has to overcome to reach his dreams. So it really is a matching piece of music, and it's really nice to listen to. It matches the movie fantastically.
Yeah, it's a really great score.
Interestingly, the cinematography, there was a Polish cinematographer called Sławomir Idziak.
I'm glad you pronounced that.
You're welcome. I was just waiting to say it, because I thought that, it'll be easier for me to say it.
Yeah. So the cinematography, I think I talked a little bit about it before, with the kind of the very smooth, clean lines and stuff. But also the use of color in this film is really interesting.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of, and this is one of the things where it's actually, if you watch it through first time, you really don't necessarily notice this unless you're paying attention to it. But there's a lot of, when there are kind of flashback type scenes, or when you're outside, it's there's a lot of sepia kind of colors. It's quite flat. So this kind of yellowy orange tone to it. And that's usually sort of associated with either some kind of nostalgia, or kind of Vincent's kind of effort to overcome whatever's going on. It's usually some kind of the sepia stuff, the kind of yellowy flat tone is him kind of engaging with his ambition in some sense. I don't know. It tends to be in those kind of contexts. And
I think it matches basically the idea of those scenes being memories, Vincent's memories, basically.
Yeah,
introducing the character to us.
You do get it in the flashbacks, but it also happens in certain scenes that are in the present in the representation. Whenever there's outside scenes, for example, it has this kind of flat sepia look. It's the same as the flashbacks.
Actually, yes, you're correct. Yes, absolutely.
So I'm not quite. Yeah, I've kind of associated that with like I said, Vincent's kind of his ambition. I think it somehow seems to show up when he's when he's on his mission in some sense. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. That's a bit of a more loose association. It's definitely there when the sepia is the case. And then there's kind of blue light showing up when there's sort of slightly more kind of inhuman stuff going on, a bit more kind of technological things. And green is interesting. Green is perhaps one of the more interesting ones because it's associated with nature. You see it kind of green in plants, green in lighting, but also it's associated with danger. There's a particular scene where Vincent and Marin are driving through this tunnel, and they're looking for someone, the police, and the light in this tunnel is really green. So the association is that nature and danger.
Actually, you're right, because in the scene when later when the scene where they are when Irene is trying to show the solar rays, just the sunrise at the solar rays, and where Vincent cannot see anything. The scenes is very green when the cars are coming towards him and he couldn't see when to run. So absolutely, it matches really the dangerous situation that sort of they find themselves.
So whenever there's danger of some kind, that it's green, and it also represents nature. So you see kind of the nature or being natural and not sort of the product of the technology and the engineering is dangerous in this world. it's a good, really nice association of those two things together. And then on the flip side of that, you've got the red being associated with kind of trusting and comfortable relationships, and it's more like this is the kind of the red of blood, right? You've got the right blood, but it's much more kind of solid. It's technological, right?
Yeah.
It's so that sort of contrasts with the way the green's used, and you see it quite a lot in the kind of medical scenes. So when Vincent's being born, all of the staff are wearing green, but the room is painted bright red. So you've got this kind of contrast of the nature, the choice of his parents to kind of have him without having engineered him, and the natural elements of it, and having is all kind of associated with the green. And then you've got like the sort of clinical engineering stuff is the red, and like there's a lot of that imagery really helps to sort of convey some of these things in a very subtle way. It's really well done.
Yes, absolutely. I didn't think about the colors until you actually mentioned it. There's some scenes, as I mentioned, that it's very noticeable, but I was going to say the sepia filter when Vincent interacts with Irene, but actually no, there's more reddish when you mentioned that now. So
yeah, it's sometimes a bit borderline between the two, right?
Yes.
Kind of a orangey color.
But the thing is, their interaction was always often, Irene's ambition to also, her trying her best to reach where, she also is trying to get to to fly and stuff, and there's always some sort of clash of their ambitions together. And
it's also it's an intermediate place between the red and the green.
Yes.
Right. It's the bringing together of the nature and the technology. Nature.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Should we then discuss the plot of the movie? So, because we're tackling it a bit, but I feel like we should go through it and discuss it in more detail.
Yes, I think, actually, to be honest, we could probably have... we've not done anything that's like massively spoilerific so far, so someone could kind of have listened in that far and then go and watch the movie and have...
I guess so, yes.
There's a few points where we've given some stuff away.
Yeah, but I guess it'd be enough to make people pay attention to what when they watch the movie. Yes, so if you're still watching this and haven't watched the movie, this is probably the best point to stop and go watch it.
Yeah, because I watched a bunch of other people talk about this in preparation for this, and that's where I stole all of this cool stuff about the cinematography from other people, because I'm not actually that good at cinematic appreciation.
No, honestly, yes, absolutely. We don't have the trained eye to, I'm sure if I spoke to some of my friends back from PhD, who were really into filmography, and then talk about what cameras were used, what did they know, the shot, the films, what was it, 20 millimeters or 35 or blah blah blah. I'm sure we would hear probably way more details on this topic, so apologize for our ignorance. We are scientists. It's not our forte, I would say.
Yeah, I cribbed what I could from other people and put that in here. But and it kind of I did most of that before I did the rewatch for this episode. So I think it was useful to have done seen a bunch of people do analysis on the film before rewatching it, because I could really notice some of those details.
Yes.
On the rewatch that I didn't pick up the first time through.
Some of the things on the plot wise, I've noticed also after reading some of the reviews why things happen. So I think it helped to observe or listen to other people's opinions before doing this. So. Yeah, but this is final point where people can, listen to us without getting spoiled. So, last chance. Continue on. Well, anyway. So, I'll introduce the plot. It has been mostly extracted from Wikipedia. I've added a few details, so please bear in mind that if you want to, it's pretty much the same copy, but we'll add some interesting facts to it. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's GATTACA is a not so distant future dystopian movie where eugenics are common, and just for everyone, eugenics is a set of beliefs and practices that aim to improve the genetic quality of a human population historically by excluding people and groups judged to be inferior or promoting those judged to be superior. Most famous example, Nazis. The whole idea of superior race and Jewish people being the inferior. So this is the best example that people probably would know probably the most. But in here, it's more used about the genetics, pure genetics of people. So in the movie, we have a genetics registry database that uses biometrics to classify those so created, so those genetically superior, as valid, while those conceived in the traditional means and more susceptible genetic disorders is known as invalids. Obviously, genetic discrimination is illegal in the setup of the movie, but in practice, as often law goes in corporations, especially like in countries in America, genotype profiling is identify everyone. And especially identify values to qualify for professional employment, while invalids are relegated to, as Richard mentioned earlier, manual jobs, cleaning, taking care of people, taking care of places, stuff like that. Of course, one can refuse genetic testing, but it will be done anyway, because the moment you touch the door handle, the moment you had a cup of water before the interview, whatever you did, a bit of hair on the seat left behind you, it will be taken and sequenced to find out the truth. So this is the setup of this society that we are, the whole story is about, that we have those valids and invalids, and making children is now down to in vitro fertilization. Taking sperm cells from the father, taking the eggs from the mother, modifying them, checking what issues would have, fertilized in the eggs, and then checking what issue that might be in fixing them. But there are children, there are people born, as we said, invalids, that are born through natural means, obviously through normal fertilization and birth, without any modifications, and they are called so-called gold children or faith births.
And in the world, it seems like there's pretty wide access to, at the very least, embryo selection, if not the genetic engineering component, because that seems to be the primary thing that they do is generate a bunch of embryos and pick kind of the best ones. But then there's also kind of optional extras of genetic engineering that are allowed or provided. So it seems like this is at a point where it's fairly affordable for many people in the population, at least, to do the embryo selection, but the genetic engineering might cost a little extra.
Yes.
And the point about the illegality of genetic discrimination in this world, Genoism as the in-world word for the genetic discrimination, Genoism, that's the term they use. There's a real world law that was kind of under fairly hot contention and debate at the time that the film was coming out. Actually, it was the initial bills about kind of anti-genetic discrimination laws being put in place in the US from 95, with quite a lot of debate going on in 96, 97. And then, GINA, which is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, was only finally passed in 2008, sometime later. It was kind of a hot topic of discussion at the time the film was being produced. And that has sort of very similar provisions that that employers are not allowed to hold genetic information on their employees and use that to discriminate with them on grounds of health insurance or employment. There are some criticisms of the way that the data holding data is described is often considered to be a little bit too vague.
The way often those bills are described, that they're written by people who have no idea about this type of info, what data is going to send, what's being. It's like recent effects, just to off topic, about ancestry. the information that people were providing to find out that their ancestry actually was stored by those companies, some of the companies in America, and sold out to third parties, right? So it has to, this type of things, those things need to stop, because this is what the whole promise of the movie. This discrimination will happen if we don't put more draconian, I would say, laws in place.
Yeah, and it's another one of those things where it's a potential the old Five Eyes game where instead of like, I as a company don't have any genetic information about you, but I've paid this third party company to get some genetic information about you.
Yes.
So am I, there's kind of, these sort of legal grey zones that let people get away with stuff, and you can already see the kind of the same kind of shady stuff that's going on in Gattaca being potentially instantiated in reality.
And I think this movie is particularly hitting close to American society, because everywhere else, at least in Europe, it's called medical history. In America, it's called pre-existing conditions. So getting insurance about pre-existing conditions, and if you want to get insurance, for example, for heart disease, as the main character had predicted, it would be much harder for people.
I mean, theoretically, it shouldn't be under GINA possible for them to charge you more for insurance if they had that genetic information about you. But that strikes me as thoroughly unlikely to actually bear out, given the way the American health system works.
Basically. So, not getting political, but America, get your shit together. So going on, continue from there. We are introduced to Vincent Freeman, our protagonist, who was conceived without any genetic alteration, resulting with him having high probability of many mental disorders and health disorders, with 90% probability of having a heart problem and a lifespan of 30.2 years. His parents, regretting the decision, used genetic selection conceiving their second child, Anton Jr. Just to point out, Anton was the name of Vincent's father, and although I think, if I remember correctly, the mother wanted to name him Anton, his father was immediately shut that idea off, because the child was obviously not perfect. But once the second boy was conceived, he immediately got the name Anton.
I think the father was Antonio, but yeah, there's the whole scene in once the father hears the list of the life expectancy and the list of probable genetic issues, then he's like, call him Vincent. So he's Vincent Anton rather than Anton.
Yes. Then the scene sort of changes, and we go where both boys growing up. Vincent, there's this scene. Sorry for just jumping in, but there's the scene when they're growing up, and Vincent is not growing as much as Anton is, and it shows that Vincent starts to rub off his name, where how tall he is, because he realizes that he'll never match Vincent, Anton, who's the perfect boy, and this sort of this rivalry between them is often depicted with the game they created between themselves called The Chicken, whereby they would go swimming out of the sea as far as they can, with the first one returning to the shore, considered being the loser. And as easily to be predicted, Vincent always loses, considering that he is smaller, has less muscle development and stuff and stamina.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they're treated with kind of very different expectations, right? Anton is always expected to do well and be the best, and Vincent's kind of excuses are made for him. You're fragile in some sense. Don't try this. It's not expected of you to be this good at this thing, which makes Vincent somewhat resentful, I think.
Yes. Obviously, when the favoritism appears in his parents, for Anton again over Vincent, obviously there would be some yeah, that would be, I would say, I understand Vincent, that Vincent would be, not, maybe I would say detest his brother and his family in general for that.
Yeah, it's certainly, certainly be a difficult situation in which to grow up, as kind of always being expected to be second best, with no real recourse on that front. Right? It's just,
But the thing is, Vincent has this a dream of career in space travel. But it's always he's always reminded of his genetic inferiority, and the flashback scene we're shown is that when one day Vincent challenges Anton to game of the chicken and beats him, where they swim out very far and Anton starts to drown and saved by Vincent. And at the time, I think this was the first time and only time at that point to Vincent to beat Anton, and that causes him realize that there's no point of him staying in this home anymore. It's time to move on. If he wants to reach for his dreams and achieve them, he needs to leave. And this is the final scene when he leaves, when Anton looks at Vincent as Vincent is leaving the house.
This is like I think a pivotal moment for Vincent, because he like up until this point he's kind of internalized begrudgingly this notion that he's second best and that he can't do better than Anton, that he's kind of predestined to not be as good. But he's throughout this he's remained extraordinarily determined. He's always studied hard and worked hard and tried to keep up and not been able to. But in this one occasion where he beats Anton, I think there's a line from the movie that this was the moment that made everything else possible.
Yes,
right. This was he had this kind of breakthrough in his confidence in his own ability to actually sort of overcome and his disadvantages, and from that point onwards, he was like, I'm doing this myself. I can do this.
Yes, absolutely. And following that, basically, Vincent just travels around, I would say, the country, although it's not stated clearly, having one job after another, and eventually ends up in the GATTACA Aerospace Corporation, whereas he's working as an invalid cleaning office spaces. It's a job that usually the invalids would get. And at some point, he gets a chance to pose as a valid through an illegal DNA broker by using hair, skin, blood, and urine samples from a donor, Jerome Eugene Morrow, as Richard introduced him earlier, a former swimming star who was paralyzed after being hit by a car. Jerome was basically moving on the wheelchair. He couldn't move his legs at all. And through the illegal DNA broker, they both come to an agreement where, using Jerome's genetic makeup, Vincent would become an employee of GATTACA. Of course, it's not without, I would say, sacrifices, because things like Vincent being shot, he needed to undergo surgery to extend his bones, his makeup, his face, the way he's dressed, the way he looked, all of these. He had poor eyesight, so he needed to put eye contacts, and all of these things were necessary for him to fully become Jerome.
It's an extraordinary kind of elaborate con job type activity that they have to do all the time. Right? He's got to brush off all of his loose skin. He's got to have skin samples and fake fingertips so he can do a blood prick to get to get in the door. And it's a huge amount of effort to go to not leave any traces of his genetic material wherever he goes.
Absolutely.
Or to keep that to a minimum, and to kind of throw everything off by putting Eugene's material wherever he can.
Yes, and
it's
and he's been doing it quite successfully. He gains an employment at GATTACA and is actually assigned to be navigator for an upcoming trip to Saturn's moon, Titan. As Richard mentioned earlier, all of this will require a massive, preparation every day, scrubbing himself from all the dead skin, the loose hairs, burning his genetic material to ensure that whatever he does, he will not be found out as the invalid, and that he can hide his heart defect. And at some point during the movie, Gattaca becomes embroiled in controversy when one of its administrators is murdered a week before the flight. As unlucky Vincent can be, the police find a fallen eyelash near the scene, and an investigation is launched to find the owner of the eyelash, considering them the top suspect. During this time, Vincent becomes close to his co-worker, Irene Cassini, and slowly falls in love with her. Though a valid, Irene has a higher risk of heart failure that basically prevents her from joining any deep space Gattaca missions. And as the movie progresses, we actually find out that Jerome tells what really happened to his paralysis, what happened to the accident to Vincent, and in fact that it was caused by his own hand, that he walked in front of that car. And that the reason why was because even though there was so many expectations and the fact that he was genetically superior, he still placed second, gaining silver a medal in the Olympics. And, even though he was designed to be the best, he wasn't. And that is the source of his suffering.
It seems from Jerome's character that I think we learned that he was depressed kind of even before he had this failure as he perceived it as an Olympic athlete. Right? He wasn't in a sort of a great mental condition, but then he also had this failing of it's supposed to be the best.
I mean, it makes sense because if you think about it, like the amount of stress and pressure on you, right? Like the movie talks about the imbalance between the classes, right? The genetically perfect people and the faith bearers, as they call them, right? Full of genetic imperfections. But the fact that the amount of pressure on those people, those genetically perfect people, is immense because they were made to be the best.
He's expected to live up to this perfection.
Yes.
But so whenever he falls even slightly short of it, winning a silver instead of a gold or something like that, then he's not living up to his potential. So it's and I think it seems though he has this a slight tendency towards depression that they weren't able to engineer out, and it gets to him that he's not able to live up to these expectations.
It's to be fair, it's interesting for me that the fact that this pressure, right? I mean, it's only a step, right? You get a silver, but then you pick yourself up and you go on and continue fighting through, right? But then again, it's hard to imagine, when in a position when you're always the best and suddenly you realize that you're not the best anymore. And I think the most example, the most real world example was when you go to university and you meet your peers, equally intelligent people, and in schools people always say, "Oh, you're so talented," blah blah, and then you meet people who are way, way better than you, way more intelligent, way they have better, And I think I've noticed a lot of people, it hits them hard.
Yeah, because I mean it's a selection filter, right?
Yes.
If you're the best at something at your local school, then it's not really that many people with skills in that thing against whom you're being measured. But when you move to a high tier university, you're now in a class of people where everyone was in the top ranking people in their local schools for that particular thing, and it just gets more acute as you go higher up the kind of academic ladder, right?
Yeah, and it's often many people leave universities because of that. It's really a interesting and surprising thing that people not realize, and you don't realize until you actually experience it. So it's I can sort of understand by observing people that these things happen.
Yeah, I said if you've never had the experience of kind of like encountering something close to like your ceiling of ability, like it hits you hard when you get close to it and notice it's there.
Yeah.
Because you measure yourself relative to the people around you, and it's just the nature of human. We do the stuff comparatively, not absolutely.
Yeah.
And emotionally, it'll hit you as solidly if you're not measuring up against the other Olympians when you're also an Olympian.
Absolutely, and so I can understand why Jerome was in was depressed because the amount of pressure on him and the fact that, I'm sure when he was in the Olympics, he was surrounded by equally genetically perfect people, right? Because, countries wouldn't send people that were not genetically perfect. So it's now the question was whether he was against the equally perfect people, or was there somebody even betterly genetically modified, right? That's the debate there, but he lost.
Mm-hmm. Actually, yeah, it's a good point, actually, because it never really touches on the details of what they do about the Olympics.
No, it's we just know that he got second place, but that's it.
Yeah, so he was in the Olympics, but like the controversies that exist over doping and genetic engineering and all kinds of stuff in the competitive sports space are complicated and very hotly contested. In this world, how they handled the fact that they've got all these genetically engineered people is.
I mean, I would say if you would take sequence Usain Bolt's genome and then try to get the same sort of genes that for his muscle density, for his stamina, for his height in other people's, and then just like genetically develop people who are as fast or even faster than him, then we have to start addressing the question of what is allowed in Olympics or not. Like some people say, and I fully agree, there should be Olympics where you can all lose, hands all loose on everything, steroids, supplements, whatever. You can just, let's see how far can we push human body to see.
I mean, so there starts to become kind of a question of like, is it ethical to condone people going to this extreme when it's probably going to have like detrimental health effects?
Well, I mean, that's the
their
thing.
Body?
As long as it's their choice, right? As long as I would love to see like how far can we push human body and science to the limits, basically. Compare. It'd be interesting. I mean, I am absolutely for the sportsmanship, right? The idea of that we all start by working hard, people working hard to achieve their dreams, right? Absolutely. But at the same time, the scientist in me, I was like, how far can we push it? And maybe that's why it's not good, because ethics hits you hard there.
And it's many of the people who compete in the Olympics these days are in some sense like the people who have the genetic traits that make them basically optimal for a given sport are the ones who end up competing in that sport because of the way the selection process works for becoming a high-end athlete in a given area, right? So if you happen to have the genetic predisposition, right, everyone will train hard, but the people who are training hard and who have the genetic predisposition are likely to be the ones who end up actually in the competition. But I think we're kind of jumping ahead of ourselves a little bit here on the discussion. But
off tangent again.
the question of like whether or not you could, so like genetically engineering someone to be like the optimal swimmer will almost certainly involve trade-offs in other areas.
Yes.
So that becomes kind of one of the more difficult consent questions in genetic engineering, like where you are directing someone's like genetic predispositions to be particularly able in some given area, potentially at the cost of being able in other areas.
Absolutely. It's
that's one of the more difficult ones.
So, for example, in swimming wise, Michael Phelps, who in the Olympics, right, is the gold medalist. He won 8 gold medals or something. I don't know which Olympics it was, but it was massive, right? But the fact is that the reason why he is so good at swimming is because of his arms span, right? His arms are unbelievably long. He's a fantastic swimmer, obviously, but there's this advantage in it. But the thing is, there is this illness that I don't remember exactly what the specifics are, but he is very closely observed by doctors, because at some point, if your arm span is 1.5, I think, of your torso or something along these lines, it is related to a genetic condition.
Is it maybe Marfan syndrome?
Say again?
Is it maybe Marfan syndrome?
Yes, I think but the syndrome causes problems with heart and very serious problems with heart. So that's why he's so closely observed, because to ensure that it's not his, long arms is one indication of the Marfan syndrome. So that's why, as Richard mentioned, like there's always a trade-off. in a lot of things. So modifying one thing to be better at something doesn't mean that there will be no drawbacks. Like if you put a higher density muscle fiber and higher efficiency of cells, like metabolism, what will happen then? How much food does this person need to consume? If they need to consume much higher calorie intake, what will happen, with their, body in general, a fat deposition, like maybe they're more prone to have higher fat levels. Who knows? These questions that's why it's so difficult, I think, to easily say we'll modify those genes out and then see what's gonna happen, right?
Mm-hmm. But we should probably come back to that a little later.
Yeah, let's come back to it later. Sorry. We'll come back to it later. So, going back to Gattaca, Vincent repeatedly evades the grasp of the investigation, and finally, it is revealed that Gattaca's mission director was the killer, because the administrator was threatening him that he will cancel the mission, and that was the motive for his death. We learn that Vincent's brother is the lead detective, but during the journey of that movie, Anton gets closer and closer to Vincent, but Vincent always sort of gets away from his grasp, and there is a scene where Anton comes and visits Jerome's or Vincent's house and meets the real Jerome, who had to climb from the very bottom stairs by crawling up the stairs. When Irene walks into the hands, welcomes in, and they have to play around that, this is the real Jerome. Although, of course, Anton realized that this is not the truth. And
Irene doesn't know at this point.
No, she didn't know, but she did still play along the whole, charade that this is the equal Jerome. But it also is interesting because the whole But at that point, as Anton was going downstairs to see, about to discover the lab, he gets a call saying that they found that it's the director who killed they found the suspect, and in fact that in the vial it was unnecessary. It was not really the cause. It was the director who killed the administrator.
Yeah, so they come really close to being discovered.
Very close. No. But surprisingly, thanks to Irene, they are not. And of course, when Anton leaves, Jerome, the real Vincent appears from the stairs, and the whole thing is up, jig is up, and but before they can have a chance to explain, Irene just runs away.
A fun fact about that scene, though, apparently Jude Law actually cracked a rib when he was trying to do that staircase thing. Yeah,
man. Wow. I mean, it was a great scene, and to be fair, but to be honest, that scene was for me, why didn't they install an elevator? You could easily have an elevator in there, because Jerome had to go out from the house in one way or another. Why wasn't there an elevator? Makes no sense.
That's a good question.
It's just, I think it's just to make the movie more dramatic, but it made no sense that in such an advanced society there wasn't possibility to install an elevator. Also, the house was quite big. Why wouldn't you want to have an elevator if you classify a small little personal elevator? Who knows? Anyway,
I think that maybe part of it. I think maybe that firstly, Jerome Eugene is trying to conceal the fact that he has this disability. Yes. So having someone in to fit an elevator might be an issue. But also, I think it's a part of it is a statement about the fact that disability is just not common anymore in this world.
Yeah.
Right. So making accommodations for the disabled is no longer a commonplace thing, because there's just they barely exist.
True. But at the same time, I would say, why wouldn't you want to have a plot? You have this spiral staircase, right? Why wouldn't you put something in the middle of it? Be oh, this is a cool sort of rich people, a little thing that I wanted to have a elevator. Why not? It's.
Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of making excuses for the plot.
I know. But, you're playing the devil's advocate, but I understand. It was more dramatic. In this way.
Yeah, it's a very dramatic scene when he's desperately trying to get up in place in time to act as himself to the police.
Yes. But eventually, and the whole as the movie goes on, and even though Vincent is safe, they meet, Anton and Vincent, and Anton warns that what he's doing is illegal, the whole identity theft and idea, but Vincent asserts that he has gotten to this position on his own merits, and Anton challenges Vincent to one more game of chicken, as the two swim out in the dead of night, Anton expresses surprise at Vincent's stamina, and Vincent reveals that his strategy for winning was not to save any energy for the swim back, and that's when Anton turns back and begins to drown again, and Vincent rescues him, and they both swim back to the shore.
Yeah, so that's an interesting one, right? Vincent's just like, I'm not gonna keep anything in the bag for the swim back. I'm just gonna keep going.
Yeah, I think at that point he was showing that he will put everything to reach, to reach his dream.
He'll back himself into a corner and like make it force himself to have to be able to swim back, yes. Because he knows when presented with a kind of a life and death challenge, he can find reserves of strength that he didn't know were there.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because the scene then changes to when Vincent goes visit after the swim and meets with Irene. And he gives her a hand, goes to sequence it, and she just like she repeats what he repeated when they first she wanted for him to test the head, to head her, to show that she's a valid, but she has this heart problem. She goes, but he recently, oops, the wind took it away, and she does the same, right? So sort of she accepts him, that even though he's not genetically perfect, but his ambitions and his drive are what's important. And on the day of the launch, Jerome reveals to Vincent that he has stored enough DNA samples, blood, urine, etc., for Vincent to last at least 2 lifetimes upon his return from the journey, and gives him an envelope to open once in flight. After saying goodbye to Irene, Vincent prepares to board, but discovers there's a final genetic test, and he currently is lacking any of the Jerome samples. But he's surprised because the Dr. Lamar, who was always doing the tests, genetics on the people, on the background checks, doing the background checks, reveals that he knows that Vincent was posing as a valid. And he admits that his own son, the Dr. Lamar's son, looks up to Vincent and wonders if whether his son genetic selected, but not all what they promised could exceed his potential as Vincent had. And of course, when Vincent, does the urine test, the detector shows that he's an invalid, but the doctor changes the test results, allowing Vincent to pass. There's on the off note, the doctor says just because Vincent is left-handed while Jerome is right-handed, and although Vincent learned how to use the right hand, the doctor says, just remember when men pee, right-handed men use the right hand, not the left hand. And
yep, so he reveals more or less that he kind of knew from the beginning
that something's off, but he never said anything. And as the rocket launches, Jerome, we have this 2 scenes. One is Jerome, the real Jerome, dons his swimming silver medal and goes into the incinerator and immolates himself. And as it happens, the flames that make the silver medal shine gold, suggesting that he finally made peace with himself. While in the same time, as Vincent is in the rocket, he opens the note from Jerome, finding only a lock of Jerome's hair. And as the movie ends, Vincent muses that for someone who was never meant for this world, I must confess, I'm suddenly having a hard time leaving it. Of course, they say every atom in our bodies was once part of a star. Maybe I'm not leaving. Maybe I'm going home. And that's where the movie ends.
Yeah, it's kind of a sort of bittersweet note at the end there, because it usually takes people by surprise what Jerome does at the end there, because he climbs into this incinerator they've been using to destroy the genetic material and just sets himself on fire, completes his failed suicide attempt of years before. But yeah, I think there's this kind of...
I think it's the point where he finally accepted his failure, and because there's the conversation between them just before they part, and Eugene says to Vincent that, I got the better deal, I got the part of the deal, right? I got your dreams, you only got a bit of my body parts, my genetic makeup, but you gave me a dream. And I think that's when Vincent finally gets to the to the ship. It's like as if his own dream was fulfilled, that he achieved something that he couldn't achieve on his own.
Yeah, I think that's
it's a sad ending, I would say, for him, but at the same time, at least he was happy at the end, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's how he kind of how he kind of explains it to himself, in a sense. Right? He's accomplished vicariously through Vincent something great, something that he could not do on his own. Lived up to a dream that he had, and I mean, it seems like he's been struggling with depression for even since before
he was drinking. He was constantly under alcohol. There was a scene where one day they had their own testing machine to make sure that the urine Jerome is using is there's no alcohol, and there's like this scene where he's testing there was 5 samples, and then 4 of them had alcohol in them, right? And so he was like, Vincent just lashes out at Jerome, was like, this is the deal, you have to stay sober, I need those samples, right? So he has to stop.
So there's more vodka in this piss than there is piss.
Yeah, exactly. That's what
he says in the moment.
There's more vodka in the piss than piss in cell. So it's
no.
I mean, it just shows how deep in depression and Jerome really was. So it's I would say in a way it's understandable, but I think through Vincent he slowly comes out of it in his own way, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one to interpret, because he still kills himself at the end.
Yes.
But at the same time, he's also had this. You get this sense that he has finally accomplished what he was, something that he could achieve something with his potential.
I guess I guess it's he still couldn't live with the fact that he failed, but he achieved something. So I guess that's
I felt that he'd completed what he was there to do. Perhaps I don't know, but yeah, not a nice way to go.
No, I would say incinerator, out of all things, are considered burning alive, is considered the worst way to go.
Yeah, pretty much.
I mean, it's the fact that people I don't remember where, but I read somewhere that from all the torture method that people were killed in medieval times, being burned alive was the bloody worst. It's just
it's pretty much one of the worst ones. Yep.
So I would say it's unless he's immolated almost instantaneously, that would be a lot of shouting.
If you sort of pass out from heat shock rapidly, then maybe you'd be a bit less. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, the way they cut the scene at the end there is also quite, because you got the fire from the jets as from the rockets,
yes,
as Vincent's taking off, and then that sort of crosses in with the fire in the incinerator with Eugene.
Yes. I guess the lock of the hair that was given to Vincent was part of Jerome going with him.
Yeah, that's what was in the letter that Jerome gave.
Yes, and I think because where Vincent said where he's going, he doesn't need the blood sample, but he said, well, when you return, you have enough for 2 lifetimes, so...
Yeah, as taking a piece of Eugene with him to the stars. That's part of the sense of fulfillment of his potential that Eugene is getting. Right? He is going to the stars in the form of Vincent.
Yes, absolutely. A fantastic movie, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, it's there are a few things that people kind of nitpick at here and there. With where it feels kind of they've got this very kind of narrow time window where they've got the launch window for getting to Titan, which actually I think that I don't know what the launch window for that would be like, but I could certainly imagine that being a highly constrained thing. So that seems reasonable.
to be honest, it was a bit I don't know, conflicting in the movie. Because it is said at the very beginning of the movie that there's I think the director says that there's a flight to space every week, right? Every week there's a flying rocket, right? And
I mean, there are more than that. It's like 12 a day or something. There's many launches.
There's a lot of launches, and you can see the scenes where, like, each time Jerome or Irene, Vincent and Irene, or Vincent himself just stares at every launch, as he as the discussion between goes. And so there's a lot of launches. So this whole program that was that Vincent was working, calculating the trajectory and stuff like that.
But I think that makes sense because it's a specific mission to Titan.
Yes.
So like even if there are many missions going up, then this particular one, Titan's a long way out. It's probably probably an exploratory one.
Yes.
To a significant degree. And it's if you want to do things like gravitational slingshot maneuvers or something to get you in particular locations, then you do have to be quite precise with the timing. But I mean, they're a bit kind of like it's exactly a week once every 70 years, so that is usually not quite as like round numbers. But
I guess, we have to accept those things, these little things in the movie.
And we have this kind of instigating incident that is sort of one of the things that drives the drama, is this, murder of the director by the administrator, or whatever the titles are. I forget exactly.
Administrator by the director.
Yeah. And that brings the sort of source of drama and tension in the film, right? This investigation is bringing far more scrutiny onto the people working at Gattaca, and therefore onto Vincent, than is normally the case, right? He can sort of, his plan for passing as Eugene is up to snuff for dealing with like the normal kind of security measures and the usual sorts of things where he might have to be tested for stuff. But when a police investigation gets involved, it's a lot more.
It gets more stressful, I would say, because there's a point where, obviously, there's some scenes where he's running on the treadmill, and for him, he pre-recorded that heartbeat by Vincent. Vincent was doing a treadmill, and so he put it pre-recorded. As the doctor says, you could use a metronome, his heart as a metronome. But obviously, when the police gets involved, things get quite heated up, because like at some point, obviously the Invalids are being lined up against the wall, like, Jewish people were lined up by Nazis, and some people are trying to run away, but they get caught. And then at some point inside of this institute itself, there's a scene where they're all called in to do a blood test, not more like a urine test or anything. They do a direct blood test. So when Vincent, because Vincent is called Jerome throughout the whole movie, and it's just so when Vincent is called in and is supposed to take the blood, he prepares a vial with Jerome's blood, and then just makes a scene where like, like, what are you doing, Doc? And then he quickly exchanges the vials, takes the one that with his blood. His blood does go squirt everywhere, to be honest, because it's an open wound, but it's because of the needle. But he escapes it, right? So he manages to
with a little bit of sleight of hand, kind of passes off a vial of Eugene Jerome's blood as his own. Yeah.
So
they switch to using Eugene's middle name and call him Eugene throughout, so that Vincent can use Jerome as his name. So I usually refer to Vincent as Vincent and to Jerome as Eugene. So there's a nice, so that it's less ambiguous. But yeah, because Jerome is kind of their shared identity in some sense.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So the movie. I mean, the movie was great, and there's a lot of little scenes and aspects where they go, and it's highly recommended. I only highly recommend the movie. There's some great quotes that the movie starts with. But Richard, do you want to introduce them?
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. So in the opening title sequence to the movie, there's a couple of quotes. There's "Consider God's handiwork, who can straighten what he hath made crooked," from Ecclesiastes 7:13. And then there's another quote, which is, "I not only think we will tamper with Mother Nature, I think Mother Nature wants us to," by Willard Gaylin, who's a clinical professor of psychiatry and a physician at Columbia, and a founder of the Hastings Center, which is a research institute focused on bioethics. So we have these kind of two slightly like contradictory quotes. Right? We've got the quote from Ecclesiastes, which I'm an atheist, and I'm prone not to thinking that much of many parts of the Bible. There is some good stuff in there, but most of it is thoroughly overrated, in my opinion. Ecclesiastes, though, is not one of those books. Ecclesiastes is one of the more interesting books of the Bible. It has this sort of existentialist perspective. It comes from the perspective of someone who's considered the teacher or the preacher, depending on the way that you translate that. And they're kind of offering advice on how to live your life after having lived a long life and having lived a life of kind of privilege. Right, he's the son of a king in this world. So, and one of the kind of points that Ecclesiastes makes is it has this kind of sense of futility. Like the opening part or the opening lines that are supposed to come from the person who authored the book are variously translated as "vanity of vanities, saith the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." Or alternatively, depending on the translation, that's the King James version. The New International Version is "meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless, everything is meaningless." And then the Christian Standard Bible gives you futility as the translation instead of vanity or meaningless. And they're all translations of a Hebrew word, hebel, which means vapor or breath, and as its kind of more direct literal translation. But they all kind of get to the sense of like ephemeralness, and the sense of like lack of progress and sort of cyclical nature of experience. And throughout the book, the preacher is kind of saying, I did all of these things, I experienced all of these things, and I built stuff, I experienced the pleasures of the flesh, but it all came, nothing ever really came to give me a sense of meaning. It was all for nothing.
It's just a side joke. It's like when your parents say, "We're just sitting there and breathing, wasting air." Basically, that's what it sort of means.
Yes, yeah, the kind of and breathing. You do it every moment of every day, right? You're constantly breathing, and it's something you have to do to maintain state, right? It's standing still, but you have to keep doing it. And that's kind of the sense that you get from Ecclesiastes, right? That he's been running on a treadmill, but not felt that he's got anywhere. And that, I think, that perspective is in part driven by the fact that this is written before much progress took place in any given person's lifetime, right? So, I mean, prior to the scientific revolution of at most a couple hundred years ago, like the rate of progress that you would expect to experience in terms of like change in your day-to-day experience of life is pretty minimal, right?
Yeah,
everything remained more or less flat, and then we had this very steep curve at the end in recent decades almost, where progress is actually taking place. So the perspective of things being static and unchanging, and there not being much like sense of progress and meaning, is one that I think is somewhat of an earlier era, but also it has a sense of there's a sense in which it is true even in the context. So to bring that back to the film, right, we've got these two characters, Eugene, who is expected to be the best. He has a very high burden of expectation placed on him and fails to live up to it. And that's a narrative that is quite common in fiction. You've got the son of the king, or the heir to the business empire, or someone who has this great weight of expectation from their heredity, from their forefathers or whatever, who built something great, and they're now expected to continue to do it, and that places a huge amount of pressure on them, and they often fail to live up to it. And the sort of internal conflict and turmoil that external weight of expectation pushes on someone, and that is even after much technological progress, that narrative is still one that is relevant in this world as a sort of human universal.
Yes.
they're not really making any progress. And similarly, you have the same thing for the structure of Vincent's narrative, right, where he's the underdog who is overcoming the scorn and the lack of expectation of him doing anything great with his life to do something more than he was expected. That's another common narrative thread, also a universal. So I think there's this sort of interesting tension that exists there in the choice of these opening quotes. Right,
Mm-hmm.
You've got both of those things, right? The sense of progress and the sense of futility, and like absence of progress in both at the same time. Right, is that much progress has been made on many of these points, but at the same time, the sort of human stories are still the same.
No, absolutely. I think that's why it made the movie so good. I mean, the little fine details they put in when you think about it, really. And honestly, throughout the whole movie, it really pinpoints a lot of things, like the future of discrimination is down to science, right? Like the whole idea of that it doesn't matter what your skin color are, where you've come from. That doesn't matter. So much is what your genes are, right? And it's a horrifying, aspect. Like even scary.
I mean, the thing that, like the sort of the core problem that they have is the reduction of genetic merit to a unidimensional thing. Right? They have this concept of a genetic quotient (GQ), mm-hmm. where it's one number that reflects your genetic quality, and you are then classified binarily into valid and invalid, based somehow on this like genetic quotient, or whether or not you were genetically engineered. So the kind of the focus that gives, there's there's some law about if the thing that you can measure becomes the thing against which you then like direct your goals, and the fact that you can measure it and the way that you measure it distorts your perception of it, and that, I think that's also part of the problem here, right? We have this in this world, this kind of one-dimensional thinking about what is and what is not like genetic quality.
Yep. It's really something that we have to be careful about, because I mean, the fact is that yes, we can modify genes, but the fact that we don't know how those combinations can affect actual development yet. I mean, talking about yet, but it's something that definitely will happen at some point, and those things will need to start be addressed.
Yeah, and the other aspect of it is just like appreciation of
diversity, I would say.
Diversity, yeah, but there's a sense in which that word is used that is not particularly relevant here.
Yes.
So, I mean, not diversity on kind of superficial characteristics, but rather diversity in terms of like abilities. Mm-hmm. Having a group of people working together on some particular task, like you need people to fill different niches, right? You need specialties.
Absolutely.
You need people to be able to perform particular specializations and functions, and that's the sort of diversity that is of greatest import to like human success, right? Is the ability to be like really good in one particular niche on a team and to complement and synergize with other people, right? That's and that can be along all kinds of different dimensions of personality mm-hmm. traits and aptitudes and all the rest of it, right? So the like attempting to maximize for one thing will end up like shooting you in the foot if you have a whole bunch of people who are of this type maximized in that dimension, but you don't have any of the other people who are needed to complement them. Right? It won't work as a dynamic to produce like effective groups of people to work on things if you only have like one subset of the people who you need to do stuff. So the kind of appreciation for diversity in that respect,
yes.
right? And diversity of
Absolutely
personality,
correct.
Diversity of approach, of ways of thinking, all those other things that are of that are actually aspects, content of character mm-hmm. as opposed to color of skin.
I need to say though, the movie, there was a lot of things happening related to the topic when the movie was coming out. as mentioned earlier, the whole laws and discussion about the whole genetic diversity laws and those debates, and and you sent me quite an interesting art poster for the movie.
Yeah, so this was a very sort of cheeky promotion that they did for the film, where they created, they took out like full-page newspaper ads for a fake fertility clinic offering to engineer children, and they had like the title "Children Made to Order," and then a little tagline of "How far will you go? How far will your child go?" And then they have all of these, we can optimize for stature and intellect and a whole bunch of other stuff that comes up in the film of these are the things that we would select your child based on. And they posted this as like a fake ad, but it presented itself as a real like fertility clinic. And they got thousands of people like calling in and responding to this advert, asking to have their children genetically engineered.
I wonder what they said when they actually got calls. Like, did they have like a call center saying, "Oh, hi, actually, this is a promotion for a movie," or?
Pretty much, I think that was what they did. Yeah, it's like actually, this is not a real thing yet. We have this movie coming out that explores this idea. It was kind of the pitch of it. Yeah. But it's I think it's revealing about how much interest there would be, and how willing, because if this technology is available, people are interested in taking you up on it.
And I think this is a great point to actually talk about the biggest topic of the movie, the eugenics, right? Because it's a narrative going throughout the whole movie non-stop, and I think and in our history, modern history, not like very modern history, in the fact that it's actually taking place non-stop, and I think we should probably touch on that, shouldn't we?
Mm-hmm. And I think the sort of the historical context of the film from that is provided by like the history of eugenics, I think is relevant, because it helps to kind of explain what the nature of the difference between the nature of the errors that they're making in that dystopian film and the nature of the errors that have been made in the past, right? Because there is a distinction that they're drawing, right? That it's they're not. In that film, they're not going back to kind of the bad old days of like forced sterilization and all the rest of it in the history that exists there, but they are still painting a dystopian picture. So it's the distinction between the two that I think is kind of worth driving home. So I mean, the term eugenics, to go back and talk a little bit about the history of it, it originates with Francis Galton in 1883. That's when he coined the term. And Galton was Darwin's cousin and kind of a general polymath and statistician. And then following on from that kind of a coining of the term to mean, as we've defined it before, it just sort of, its literal meaning is kind of well-born and had this general notion of just, improving genetic quality of the population, right? Of breeding for good people. I mean, he learned. Like the application of the idea was taking what we do in animal breeding and applying it to humans was the idea, right? It was we've managed to create all of these kind of extraordinary varieties of horse and pigeon and all of the cows and all the rest of it, right? We have all of these kind of like optimized organisms for particular tasks that are, in some sense, that is relevant to characteristics that we're interested in are better than their kind of wild origins.
Can I just say it sort of doesn't make sense for humans though, right? Because when you think it's like,
it depends what you're interested in.
Yeah, but that's the thing, right? If you're interested in, like, let's say the movie Eugene was swimming, right? So you want certain characteristics and tall person, long arm span, stuff like that. But there's so many different things that one can pursue, right, in the world. In animals, quite simplistic, but for example, horses. Why are we interested in horses? There's speed, right? Because it's horse racings. We are not really interested anymore in using animals like horses for farming, so they don't have to be that strong. Nowadays, they're mostly used for horse racing. Now, that's what people are interested in, right?
Speed, yeah.
So it's one thing, right? Dogs, I don't know, their intelligence, friendliness, I don't know, there may be 2-3 things that people can think of. But humans, like, there's so many things that could would have to, I just cannot grasp the idea like that, a person
And yeah, I think I know what you mean. And the thing that Galton fixated on quite a lot was intelligence.
But the thing is, which is interesting, that on average, the intelligence levels is actually increasing, right? The IQ levels of the populations are increasing.
Yes. I mean, the variety of explanations for that in terms of...
Well, I don't know the reason behind it, but I'm aware that statistically it's taking place, that the IQ level, general intelligence of the population is rising, even though people say that the younger populations are dumbed down, but that's often because of minorities and the internet and social media, right? That's the very aspect that often is out there that's interfering against it. But overall, it seems that on average the population is getting smarter.
I mean, that's definitely it's been well documented. I'm trying to remember the name of the effect. There's a guy after whom it is named for something effect, where intelligence does seem to be on the increase. And yeah, there's a fairly complicated discussion as to why that is the case, but it's definitely not genetic because it's too fast.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, basically, I have no knowledge about this topic. It's just I've just noticed that there is this trend that was described. I'll have to investigate it a bit further in the detail, but it sort of counters this person's, counters Francis Galton's idea that, you need to have selective breeding for such thing take place.
Well, I mean, it counters the idea that you can only achieve it through selective breeding.
Yes,
but it doesn't mean to say that you couldn't necessarily, you could potentially achieve that through selective breeding. I think that is... it doesn't rule out the fact that it's increasing from environmental causes does not rule out the possibility that it can increase from
no, absolutely, you're absolutely correct.
Well.
Yes,
yeah. But yeah, so one of the things though that kind of characterized Galton's error in this area was that he was very much fixated on the genetic, explaining what is much better explained in our modern studies, particularly of intelligence, on by environmental factors. He tended to be somewhat biased towards explaining stuff by genetic factors that might well better have been explained by environmental factors. I didn't really have the experimental methods and the sort of working in 1907 and before.
Yeah, the scientific methods at the time were not the best.
Yeah, they didn't have the tools necessary to pick apart the distinction that we have a kind of much more fine-grained picture of these days.
Yes.
So part of the reason why eugenics became kind of an area of interest back in this era, there was kind of concern over increasing numbers of people in poverty, people who were considered kind of unfit in society. There was a lot of concern over this kind of beginnings of the Industrial Revolution and leaving all of these people in kind of a poor physical state, mostly because of environmental factors. But there was a concern that this was like a genetic thing, like the population is degenerating, and it became part of the concern became kind of acute in the Boer War and the First World War when we needed to recruit a bunch of people to be in the army, and there was all of these people are not meeting our physical standards for getting into the army. So that was kind of one of the zeitgeist at the time was this concern over the possibility of a genetic degeneration of the population when it was actually mostly environmental. And so this eugenics society was founded in 1907. It still exists. It's since sort of transformed itself into an educational charity about heredity and genetic issues, now known as the Galton Institute. I've actually been to one of their conferences. It's kind of a regular scientific conference. They held it at the Royal Society building in London.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
No more we should eradicate the poor people.
Well, so that's the thing. It was always within the Eugenics Society there was a split between the people who were in favour of positive eugenics and the people who were interested in negative eugenics. So positive eugenics is this kind of assortative mating type thing, right? Encouraging the people who were supposedly hereditarily more intelligent and better off,
superior
the members of the kind of upstanding upper classes, as it were, right? People who were doing well for themselves in some sense, right? Encouraging them to have more children. And then there was the negative eugenics, which was the preventing the people who were unfit from having children. And there was a kind of even from the early days of this idea, a lot of tension between those groups who were, some of whom considered the negative eugenics to be unethical, and some of them considered the positive eugenics to be impractical, because you have to persuade people to have more kids and to have, pick particular partners on grounds that would be in this kind of weird intellectual fashion of selecting a partner who's like a good genetic match. So there's a lot of not a particularly practical idea to do selective breeding in humans, because it's going to be weird or profoundly unethical. So that's the just to spell out that divide between the positive and the negative eugenicists. And the Eugenics Society, they backed a bill. The title of the bill was the Feeble-Minded Persons Control Bill, which sounds particularly terrible in modern parlance. And that was in 1912, but that failed to pass Parliament in the UK. And that was a compulsory sterilisation bill.
I mean, honestly, wow. It's just, I swear, when you listen to history of these things, it really blows your mind. When in one of our episodes about xenogenesis, when we were talking about, I think I mentioned that animals had more rights before even children had in UK, in late 1900s. Just wow, honestly. There's some really dodgy things that have been appearing in the history of...
Yeah, although so in this particular case, this bill was not passed.
Thank God.
And this was kind of... It set in the UK, it set a fairly anti... compulsory sterilisation, fairly anti... negative eugenics tone. I mean, there were still a number of things that did go on in the UK, but it got... where it got particularly bad was where it moved to the US, and then in some sense back to Nazi Germany. So that's where it really got tied up with the kind of racial politics of those other countries. And the Eugenics Society distanced themselves from Nazi race hygiene in 1933, reasonably early on. But and this whole kind of movement, like the eugenics movement, was very popular with kind of progressive, prominent, sort of liberal social thinkers. The economists, John Maynard Keynes, there's Julian Huxley, the statistician R.A. Fisher, Peter Medawar, famous biologist, Marie Stopes, who I think an early birth control pioneer. Churchill actually spoke in favour of that 1912 compulsory sterilisation bill. So it was a politically popular movement at the time, if not very, at least with the elites. It never gained kind of huge populist support in the UK, at least. And then the eugenic ideas kind of rose to prominence in the US, and then later in Nazi Germany, or around the same time. And as I said, it kind of became intertwined with race and class politics, mixing bad science with this inability to distinguish environmental from genetic factors in with bad populist politics to doubly bad results. And there's a lot of use of forced sterilization by various totalitarian and repressive regimes around the world. There's still some of it.
It's still happening nowadays.
Going on today. Yeah, I mean, the one that's most politically imminent is the Uyghur population in China, North Korea. But throughout the history since then, it's been a feature of totalitarian and repressive regimes. But the way it kind of got started in the US was after having kind of got the seeds of eugenics from the British Eugenics Society and from Galton's ideas. It was Charles Davenport in 1910 started the first eugenics records office in Cold Spring Harbor in the US, and worked with I think this guy called Harry Laughlin to draft a bunch of kind of possible legislation about forced sterilization and so on. And ultimately that led to more than 60,000 people being forcibly sterilized in between 1907 and 1970 in the US. And it went on for a long while, right? 1970.
Yeah, it really did.
Yeah.
I mean, in general, America used to be a bit slow about, the repercussions of certain things and addressing them.
Yeah, a few places where it tends to hang on for a while.
But I mean, throughout the history, it's been prevalent. I mean, as the most popular example is the Nazi Germany, right?
But just to finish up the last bit on the people who were kind of targeted for things like forced sterilization were people who were considered in some sense mental defective. There's a bunch of different, imbecility and various things that are usually used as insults that were kind of medicalized terms for varying degrees of mental impairment. And then there was, people who were epileptic or schizophrenic or a lot of things that are now treated as mental health issues were kind of subject to this forced sterilization. And a lot of these things have genetic components to them, but are not particularly strongly genetically determined. Right? They have environmental factors as well for many of these things. So I mean, like I say, a mix of bad science and bad politics. Yep. And then, of course, in the sort of ultimate realization of the worst possible version of eugenics is Nazi Germany. And the kind of eugenics movement got kind of started out in 1921 with Erwin Bauer, Fritz Lenz, and Eugen Fischer, kind of propagating this Aryan master race idea. And I think Eugen Fischer was made the head of the Berlin Academy of Sciences, or so I forget the exact name of the institution. And this became kind of a major part of the Nazi propaganda and political program. This whole kind of survival of the fittest attitude. And that actually has its history a little bit further back, even in World War One. There was influences of the kind of survival of the fittest attitude. This notion that if the empire kind of succeeded in conquering Europe, then it was proved that they were the genetically fit superior people. This kind of naturalistic fallacy of just because this is the way things are in nature, this is the way they should be. Ideal. And then, those kind of escalated from the initial notions in 1921 through to the sterilization program in 1933, and then Himmler's eugenic breeding program in 1935, the Lebensborn program, kind of encouraging the positive eugenics component, encouraging people to have children, the Aryan races to have children with other Aryans. And then there's in 1937 it starts to get more heavy on the racial component, with the Gestapo rounding up people who are of some kind of criminally impure race, and taking them off to the gas chambers, and through 1939 to 1945, around about 250,000 people were killed in Operation T4 for being hereditarily blind or suffering from alcoholism or some form of idiocy, mental impairment that they so a huge number of people, and then of course the race hygiene component with the final solution that was devised in the Wannsee Conference and the Holocaust. So yeah,
the history of it is not roses and no, it's awful. And I think it's the fact that it's the idea, although initially I would say with a good intention, it wasn't well thought through, and bad conclusion, as you said, were taken from poor science. Yeah,
that's a good. The upshot of it is that combination of poor science and poor politics.
Basically,
the lack of understanding of what was and was not genetically determined, and then the bad criteria for which to apply to particular characteristics. Right, the racial component of it, which is often even not particularly strongly related to many of the genetic variations in which you might actually be interested for people's for the qualities of people that you're actually might be interested in improving, like intelligence and so on. These things are very they vary vastly more within the population than they do between the populations, right? So the association of it with genetic factors is particularly poor science.
Yep. And I think this is why GATTACA is such a good movie, because it addresses more of not the past, as you mentioned earlier, but the future of it. The whole idea of the understanding that, obviously the movie doesn't go into specifics, because obviously they didn't have those specifics at the time. Obviously nowadays there's a lot of those cases of like which genes to pick would be quite difficult still, because it's not as simple as just a gene, right? The idea of just being a gene. There's a lot of other aspects to the DNA, things like epigenome and stuff like that affect it. So
absolutely, yeah. I mean, it remains still a very complicated problem. But I think the part of the so we have this history where between the 1900 and 1945 or so, we had this really bad collection of ideas that led to these horrendous consequences. Yes. And then we had this kind of swing back very much in the opposite direction. So in this era, it was all about nature, right? It's about genetics, it's about predetermination, it's about engineering the people to have these innate characteristics. It's very much focused on that. So in reaction to that, we have a swing in the other direction. We have a complete emphasis on environment, and everything is nurture, and very little is nature, right? So it's all the kind of the blank slate hypothesis, right? All this stuff where you start with basically everyone is pretty much the same, and then environment determines more or less everything about who you are and all the rest of it. But this is in recent decades we've kind of come to we have this tension between the fact we have this terrible history of having been overly focused on genetic determinism, and now we're kind of encountering places where the blank slate hypothesis doesn't quite live up to the reality, right? Not everything is determined by environment. There is actually some influence of genes, and on average, if in the sort of broadest possible statement, more or less half.
Yeah,
right?
honestly,
you can explain more or less half of the variation. And when you look across all the different studies for all the different characteristics of people, from personality traits to all kinds of stuff, whenever there's something that has a vaguely continuous variation in its property, roughly half of that variation is explained by genetics, and roughly half of it is explained by environment.
And I think the problem, as you mentioned, is the idea of this conversation is that because of the history, it's the moment you raise it up, this whole idea starts to get blasted as being those ideas, those observations get blasted with the referencing of the past.
And it makes a great deal of sense, right? We should be acutely aware
absolutely.
of how we can fail on this dimension.
Absolutely. It's just the fact that also that we have to be considerate of those things as well. It's really interesting because a lot of things, moderation is the answer, right? A compromise. Yet people tend to swing to the extremes so easily.
Yeah, I think the history sometimes gets in the way of us of seeing more clearly what's actually in front of us when it comes to we're sort of too afraid to acknowledge the reality of genetic difference because of the fact that it's been so misused and it's been so tied up with bad politics that the potential to do good with a more nuanced understanding gets kind of pushed aside because of the political history. But again, it makes a certain amount of sense why that happens.
No, it does. But the question now then is let's say this hypothetical scenario, right? I just want to have this conversation, just as a discussion. So we ban all genetic engineering modifications to human embryos, right? Whereas, for example, let's say a country where it doesn't have such regulations starts to do modifications, right? And we have an increase of humans, let's say, like in GATTACA, who are no, maybe not yet perfectly. They're not ideal genetically, but they have, let's say, running, right? They're better in running, and we have a person who suddenly from one of those countries comes in and then beats people who like Usain Bolt, right? Let's say that they're just so perfectly, they don't need any stimulants or anything. They're just basically
and like the that particular I forget the name of the group, but it's around Ethiopia where the guys who are like insanely good at marathon running.
But like, let's say that the sequencing of those people has been available for those countries that do not have the laws that ban those modifications, and you have people who are better, let's say, simply described as better. But then that raises a problem, because one, what do we do at that point, right? Do we exclude those people? And how about all those studies that are out there, like treating genetical diseases that could be fixed before the person is even born? So I think that the idea of nowadays, I mean, it's been 70 years since Nazi Germany, Second World War, and all those horrendous histories, and of course we shouldn't forget them. But
I think that's actually one of the things that GATTACA does well, is it comes to this question with a modern understanding of it, and with it presents the current and more nuanced dilemma, and it doesn't cast it over much in the historical context.
And I think this is what it makes it great, that it doesn't bring that history in, but the fact is that those things will happen eventually, and the question is now we need to address it in a format that, one, it doesn't forget the history but doesn't get the history involved too much in it, because our understanding of certain things is now much more in depth.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's worth emphasizing the current upsides of using kind of what is essentially a eugenic technology, right? So when you do things like choosing not to have children who will die of a congenital disease, that's more, it meets the definition of eugenics in the sense of improving the genetic quality of human rights, right? It's a eugenic thing to do, but and it's using that technology, but it's doing it for great good. And one of the kind of the early pioneers of this were the Jewish population in Brooklyn, where there's a high incidence of this very this horrendous childhood congenital genetic disease called tay-sachs, where children rarely live beyond 4 years old, and so I think it's 6 is rarely live beyond 6 years old, and usually suffer immensely before they die. And so there's this one of the early examples of the kind of this it wasn't really genetic screening, but rather mating arrangements to pairing arrangements to avoid having children who will be born with this disease. So it's not fertilizing an embryo and testing it, but rather organizing it such that people who are carriers, so you can do a genetic screen for carrier status of this disease, are not going to have kids together, or would be advised against it. So there's this charity called Dor Yeshurim that was founded by a guy who survived Nazi-occupied Hungary and had lost 4 children to tay-sachs.
It's just for everyone. It's an awful disease. Basically, it's destruction or degeneration of nerve cells in the brain and spinal cord. So it's written here that most cases, babies from age of 3 to 6 months lose the ability to turn over, sit, or crawl. Basically, their nerve cells are dying. Wow. So those things these things have to be addressed in a way that, with the better understanding and the better science.
There are tragically thousands of these very rare genetic conditions that lead often kind of monogenic traits, right? Single gene mutations that cause these kind of horrendous childhood diseases that are very lifespan limiting and often produce terrible suffering. There's a lot of them out there. The individual diseases are rare, but when you add up all of the rare diseases, there's a lot of people. who are in this situation. So having the technology to screen, either to, like in the particular case of the this kind of Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn, it was kind of because they have an arranged marriage tradition anyway, it's a bit of an unusual way of working it in for the rest of society. But picking or choosing not to have children with a partner who you marry, or having children with someone, picking your partners based on whether or not you can have children who will or won't have this condition.
Yeah,
a bit more of a social imposition than many of the rest of us might put up with, but perhaps more in line with the tradition. But still, there are some
conditions out there that could potentially be affected. That's why we screen ourselves a lot for a lot of conditions. And there's even nowadays, in UK, you get to be screened before you have children to see if there's anything like spina bifida. Like, that's why people are given, to women are supposed to take folic acid. And even if you don't have those predispositions, you're still encouraged to do so to ensure proper development of the neural crest and the spinal cord in babies. So I think,
and I say increasingly the Dorish Ream stuff is kind of an early example of it, and it's since become much more prevalent.
It makes sense because this population is increasing as well. So it's obviously a lot of things that were quite rare will become more common with the population increasing.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And with our understanding of the genetics of all these conditions improving, and our ability to diagnose them with sequencing and so on, it increases a lot. Right. So we've kind of moved from there's a number of different places at which you can do the genetic screening, right? You can screen the parents to see if they're carriers for these conditions, and then how much risk they will have of having kids with those diseases. And then you can the next step from screening parents is you can do amniocentesis and screen a naturally conceived embryo to see if it has some kind of genetic defect, right? So you can take a sample from the fluid in the mother. From the
amniotic sac.
What's the name of the amniotic fluid? That's the You take a sample from the amniotic fluid and sequence the cells in there, and ascertain whether or not the child has some genetic condition that might cause you to choose to abort pregnancy. And of course, that has some people have a religious opposition to aborting pregnancies and so on. So it's not everyone is a fan of that approach.
So pre-screening conditions is probably in this case beneficial for those people, I would say.
And also, like for an individual experiencing it, so that just to describe the next technology, as it were, right? So the next thing is fertilizing the embryo in vitro, right? So you create your embryo in vitro in a not a test tube, but usually something resembling a petri dish, right? You create that in the lab, and then you can take a sample of cells from that and do the genetic screening, which is kind of what you see in GATTACA.
Exactly. There's this exact scene that shows that step.
Yeah, it's not quite accurate because those are like 4-cell stage embryos, and it's usually a little bit later, kind of when you've got a blastocyst within a cell mass, and you can take a cell sample from the. That's
one of the points that my fiance, who's an expert in this field, actually pointed out, that those cells are actually 4-cell stages. The sequencing wouldn't happen at that stage. So, yeah.
It's a little later on in the process where you can take a single cell sample or a couple of cells out of the embryo and sequence those to see to do some genetic diagnosis on it. And then you can choose which embryos you implant and take to term. But that approach, I mean, both are not particularly fun for the mother. The amniocentesis and potentially aborting the fetus, right? That's not good. But the process of going through the fertility treatment to get the artificial ovulation and extract the eggs and so on, that's also not particularly fun. So like neither are great from the experience of the mother, but it's arguable that the not having to carry like multiple pregnancies and potentially abort them is like a less traumatic experience to go through, right?
Yes,
because there have been people who have had like many pregnancies and aborted them because they have tested negative for some particularly unpleasant genetic disease. So like the strain that places on people is pretty extraordinary. So if you can avoid that,
I feel like finding out that your child is being born, several children are being born with conditions. They often break the families because it's the question is who's in fault, as they say, and then it's.
Like the kind of spurious assigning of blame, right? It's often not anyone's. It's never anyone's fault, right? It's their genetic material, right? It's just.
It's not something that can do anything about it, right? I mean, nowadays there's some things we can, but in the past you couldn't do really, and then the whole idea of blaming people is just.
So, to get a little bit into the, in order for the pre-implantation genetic diagnosis stuff that I described, where you have a fertilized embryo in a dish that you extract some cells from and do some genetic testing on. In order for that to be possible, we had to have the IVF technology. Just to talk a little bit the history of that. So, like the first IVF baby was born on July 24th, 1978. Her name was Louise Joy Brown. She was conceived in a petri dish in 1977 to parents John and Leslie Brown. So relatively recent in the grand scheme of things, 1978. And there have since been at least 5 million IVF births. I can't remember from when. It's probably considerably more than that now. That number's probably a bit out of date. But that that kind of set the stage for the possibility of doing this pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, like the increase in our ability to do genetic screens and the ability to do sequencing and genetic diagnosis on small numbers of cells has improved dramatically, such that it's now practical to do pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So if you have a family history of a particular condition, for example, in the UK, this stuff is all kind of overseen by the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority. And they have a list of, I think it's a little over 600 genetic conditions for which you can be screened. So if you want to conceive a child through IVF and do pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, you can have it checked and you can then exclude embryos based on the criteria for diagnosing those 600 or so conditions. Yep. I believe I don't think it is legal in the UK to discriminate on other grounds. You can sometimes discriminate on sex grounds because there are sex-linked disease inheritance patterns.
Yes.
So if it's the case that you can select a male embryo or a female embryo that won't have a disease that would definitely be in a male or female counterpart, then that's permitted. But in other places, it's a bit more of a regulatory Wild West when it comes to this sort of thing. Like the US is a usual complicated patchwork of state-level laws that usually amount to someone somewhere can probably, if they have enough money, figure out a way to make it work.
Yeah.
But that's, take, for example, there's an interesting history of the first case of a 3-parent child. So this is the one when there are certain conditions that are
recently
caused by.
Recently in the UK, there was this massive debate about it, wasn't there?
Yes, so actually, we actually changed our regulations based on kind of the impracticality of how it ended up being done the first time around. So the first case I think was a Jordanian couple. So the reason why you have this procedure in the first place, kind of a complicated IVF procedure, right? So there are certain genetic diseases that are inherited from the mitochondrial genome. So in our cells, we have the nuclear genome, which is where 99% of our DNA resides. That's most of the genetic payload. But we also have these organelles, the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, as
memes go. But those are inherited from the mother side, always from the mother side.
Yes, so they're only inherited from the mother, but you can also get genetic diseases that affect your mitochondrial genome. So what the solution to that problem, if you have a mother who has mutations in her mitochondrial genome, is you can take the nucleus from the mother's egg, the cytoplasm with the mitochondria in it from a third-party donor who's only contributing the mitochondrial DNA, and then the sperm from the father. So you end up with 99% of the DNA, more or less, is from the two
and
parents,
1%
who are
from the mitochondria.
1% mitochondrial is coming from a third person, and that's a little controversial because it's introducing a permanent genetic change, right? So if any daughters of someone created with this IVF procedure had children, their children would have permanent genetic differences that are from the fact that they inherited the mitochondria from this third parent, right? So it's introducing a germline genetic change, which is one of the reasons why it was controversial. But in order to achieve this in the first instance, I think it was like the screening had to take place in the UK, and then the complicated fertilization procedure with the three cells had to take place somewhere in New York, and then the implantation had to take place somewhere in Mexico, because of the different regulatory regimes that were present in, and the different technical expertise that were present in all those areas, right? So they couldn't do the screening without the UK people. They couldn't do the complicated IVF procedure without the New York people, and they couldn't implant it either in the UK or in New York because the regulations would restrict it. So they had to go to Mexico to have it implanted. So, it was an insane process to do that the first time around.
I can imagine the logistical transportation of those embryos, right? Like, you have to send them over, and I guess it's probably in like, I don't know, liquid nitrogen or on dry ice to ensure that, like, there's survivability, and then it's just,
this was less than ideal. So it is now, I think, it's been made legal in the UK to have this procedure, the three-parent child procedure for people with mitochondrial diseases.
They really do.
So it's no longer necessary to do this crazy shuffle.
They really do like simplifying things. Three-parent, like, it's not really three-parent thing, right? Because if the 99 point something of genetic information comes from the parent, the actual parents, and it's only just mitochondrial DNA, it's not a third parent. It's just a bit of.
I mean, technically, it's always kind
a technicality,
but it's just
but
like
when you call it like that, it's just like, you know.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It becomes, but
you know, you could have a family where this is, I don't know, like, let's say 2 mothers and a man, right? Like polygamy, and then you can call them a 3-parent family, but it's not the same thing, right? So it's I feel like the language often used by populists and newspapers always just make it or highlight it as like, oh, a big thing, but I feel like it's always gets against the point of this whole of the whole thing, right?
I mean, inevitably there's a certain amount of simplification that takes place, right? It's hard to escape. But so just to kind of relate back to that technology, so this is kind of akin to the technology that we see in GATTACA, right? So this genetic screening for particular traits, right? But the thing where it diverges a little bit is the number of embryos from which you have to select in kind of the pre-implantation genetic diagnosis type procedures that happen today is usually quite small, because generating, a woman normally only has, I forget exact numbers, but something in the order of a few hundred embryos or eggs rather, with the potential to reach maturity.
Overall, the woman's lifespan is around 400 or so eggs that are produced, that are viable. I think that's the number.
Yeah, somewhere in that general ballpark, right? In on the order of a few hundred at the upper end, right? So when you have when you induce ovulation of like an unusually large number of eggs from a woman in order to do the IVF treatments, you have a pretty small number of embryos to work from. So you can't do this kind of like sampling a huge number of different possibilities and then picking the best ones without introducing some additional steps, right? So potentially you could cause these cells to divide and keep them in a early embryonic state in some sense, so that you can produce many more embryos, because oftentimes at a very early stage in the embryo, this is what happens with twins, right? Very early stage in the embryo, they split into two separate cell masses for monozygotic twins.
That's true. You could preserve the cells and then just in case.
Exactly, right? So there's a limit to to sort of how many divisions after the initial division you can get away with. Actually, that process.
If I can say something about this, because we were interested when I was doing investigation on that. My wonderful fiance who notified me that actually there's few studies done that show that after at 4 cell stage, right? So the very early, we're talking about 48 hours or so after fertilization, although genetically identical, the epigenome of the modifications to the DNA, some methylation and stuff like that, and histone modifications actually changes is different for each of the cells. So at that very stage, although cells may be totipotent, i.e. being able to produce as many, all the different cell types, but the fact is that those cells already are differentiating towards specific types of cells. So it's already at that stage could be a bit late for a lot of things to take place and be able to use those cells to, create a separate human being if we take one cell out of it.
But so one of the ideas that people have is doing embryo breeding, right? So you take an embryo that you've created, and then you do transdifferentiation. So you take a cell and you cause it to develop into another cell type, into germ cells. So you take an egg and you transdifferentiate it, maybe split it, and you make 2 embryos, and you transdifferentiate some into sperm-producing cells and some into to eggs. So you get oocytes and sperm from the embryos that you've created, and then you breed them to create or use them to fertilize. So you have this kind of if you can persuade the cells to actually do that.
If you can persuade them, yes, that's a big caveat.
Yeah. Like that's we don't. This is not something that we can currently do effectively and safely. But if you could do that, then you could do that procedure where you kind of have where you generate like all the possible genetic diversity from the 2 parent genomes by just breeding the embryos in vitro. So you've still got the reshuffling of the different genetic characteristics that takes place during meiosis. So you can do that. What the geneticist in the film calls like picking the best of you, right? So you create all of these different embryos, and then you select the ones that have have had all of the most desirable genes shuffled onto the same chromosomes.
But I need to say something about the technology actually in GATTACA, right? If we can go back to the movies, technology of the sequencing, in fact. Because yes. You get the samples and you get the sequence almost immediately, right? Which is pretty fantastic technology. We are getting there. Actually, in fact, the technology is very spot on, I would say. The first sequencing methods came to life in late 1970s, and with the first human genome being sequenced and completed in 2001. I think that was the completion of the Human Genome Project, the Sanger sequencing method. But from there, we had the second generation of sequencing starting in 2005, which cut down the time of the sequencing and the cost. And then we had now the third generation, which even further cut down the time and cost. Though it's still costly. It's still at the price of a little small car, I would say several £1,000s or dollars, whichever you. But we're, I think, on the way of the sequencing. But I wanted to point out that one funny scene from the movie. Actually, you pointed out to me as well when Irene went to sequence Vincent's hair that he purposely left on his comb. and she just got this like long paper of like AATTCCGATT blah blah blah, the whole sequence. Like, you wouldn't get that. That's like several billion letters. Like, you would like in realistically, you wouldn't get just a piece of paper. You would literally get like books and books and books. Like,
yeah, like, there's a you can Google for like images of what the human genome printed out looks like, and it's like a roughly 2 meter by 1 meter bookshelf,
basically, of like just very
filled
tiny
the entire wall of like massive, like larger than encyclopedia sized books, and they're printed in like 7-point font. It's like tiny.
It's crazy. Then, and it's not understandable for anyone. That's why when you do analysis,
not even remotely.
That's why we sequence them. We're like, oh, this is the gene. We know what this does. This is the sequence of the specific gene, and we matched it against the sequence of the human genome. And that's what the Human Genome Project was, to understand what do sequences do and what they map to. And that's why, like, it's most likely, more realistically, what would happen is that if Irene went to such place to get the sequence, she would probably get like, you know, like what we call ontology analysis, where like, oh, this is what, you know, those genes are, what maybe levels of expressions are, but still that would be a massive printout. But even further, it would be like generalized, you know, the upregulation of certain genes, downregulation of certain, you know, no change against the, like, the, I would say, standard.
I mean, so it's probably, even that's like probably way too complicated and abstract. The genetic testing results are probably going to be like much more reduced to, you know, this is
what you're interested in, like what are his genes, you know, like specifically interesting.
Like a polygenic risk score for some particular trait is the sort of thing that you'd likely be presented with, right? This is like the aggregate estimate of how likely it is that they'll have this particular disease or this particular character trait, given what we know about all these different genetic loci, right? It's if you want to, like, anyone can actually go and like take a look at how the genome is annotated as a kind of and look what the sequence is at some of the Genome Browser websites, like UCSC's Genome Browser or Ensemble's Genome Browser, and you get the sequence is you only see that when you zoom in real close, and look right up at something.
Makes sense, even if you know what the genes are there. It still doesn't make much sense for like average user.
I mean, it's like sometimes if you have a specific question about a particular mutation, you go right in and look at a particular sequence, but like quite frequently you're interested in kind of larger scale features, you know, and if you go into a genome browser, you have this kind of linear track of all the sequence along the bottom, but then you have all of these annotations, all of these kind of features, and like this region corresponds to this gene which does this thing, and all these kind of layers of information that are stacked up on top of the sequence.
So I would say that
you can look at.
So that binary, who's that person, like understanding, yes, that makes sense in the GATTACA, absolutely okay. But for anybody just going to a shop and like, no, I want to know the sequence, I understand what this person is, it's probably, you would have to ask a specific question for that, at that booth. What do you want to know?
I mean, like, I imagine that they would, you could offer the general kind of, like, the same way that, like, 23andMe
or, like,
but it won't be presented to you as a sequence of A's, T's, G's, and C's.
It'd be like, unless you want to specifically ask for it, just, I don't know, like, it's a joke to put it on your wall or something. But overall, I don't think anybody would want that.
No, it's not practical.
So I just thought that this idea of, like, the sequencing, we are getting there. There's many different methods, and in our xenogenesis discussions, we've discussed those actually pretty early on. Our first few episodes, I think we've talked about those. So I would highly recommend to go there and check those out, because there's, in the notes sections, you will find the links to those. It's just found something it's quite interesting that those that printout of those sequences pretty funny. But there's one thing that was,
and I think it's an interesting it's an interesting comment on the way that the society kind of handles that stuff, though, right? it's permitted for you to just sort of show up with someone else's genetic sample and get a report on them, right? That seems like the sort of thing that almost certainly be
absolutely.
illegal.
In any country, it'd be illegal to do such thing. It's
I mean, it probably isn't, but it probably should be.
To be honest, I think it probably is. You can't just go and be like, can you sequence this for me? I
don't know what actually let's say you order a 23andMe kit and do it for someone else.
I wonder, like, maybe, how do you call it? The ancestry testing, like maybe sending a sample from a person, I don't know, maybe would be, I don't know.
You might run afoul of some kind of data protection laws or some kind of theft.
Data Protection Act.
It's not like a specific law to handle that case.
Yeah, but like there's the general data protection regulations that falls under those regulations. But I don't know. It is something that it's just like it feels weird that somebody like. You go on a date someone and they take your cup and then just go and sequence it to see what's wrong with you. It's just like...
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if someone starts trying to do like genetic compatibility.
Yeah, be like...
Dating
be like...
Where you
find
offer
your
that
perfect partner. And then it's like, we offer you the ability to check if your partner will make you happy with your children. When you have children, make you happy and your children will be what you always wish them to be.
Actually,
I'm gonna try
that. There's a sci-fi series that already or book that already explored an idea a bit like that. I think it's called The One. But yeah, it's a bit more of like a some kind of the science version that they present there is not that's not likely to be true. It's kind of like a particular genetic profile matches you with like one at maybe a couple of people with some degree of uncertainty who like you will be like chemically like attracted to on like a really strong level, which it's probably unlikely to be quite that.
But there's one thing that was pointed out to me again about what GATTACA didn't fail to predict. And you made notes about the CRISPR technology, CRISPR-Cas technology, but the fact is that obviously it's now viable, and I would like you to talk about it a bit more in a second. But the fact that they failed to predict that we can actually modify genes in adults, right? That there's starting to be technologies to be able to actually modify them, like for example cystic fibrosis. I think I mentioned that before. That be able to deliver the system, the CRISPR-Cas9 system, into the cells and be able to modify certain conditions out, right?
Yes, I think it's worth pointing out that in genetic therapies, there's the main distinction that we draw is between somatic and germline gene therapies. And a somatic gene therapy is altering the genetics of the cells of your body that are not going to be inherited by your children, should you have any, right? So they don't affect your egg cells and your sperm cells. You're directly altering the genetics of cells, usually in some kind of affected tissue, right? So in the case of cystic fibrosis, it would be trying to alter the genetics of some cells in the lungs. And that's usually done with something like a viral vector, and it's usually targeted for a very specific intervention, like altering the CFTR protein in the case of cystic fibrosis. But the difficulty with doing it at the adult level is that
not all cells will be actually, the chance of all transfecting of cells is very low. It's going to be, as they call, very mosaic.
Exactly. So you have this efficiency problem where only cells that sort of happen to get infected with this viral vector that's going to carry the repair gene, and then that happens to kind of work correctly and integrate it. It's or kind of a low chance of it actually, working in any individual case. So you get this mosaic, incomplete genetic engineering phenotype, which can oftentimes be enough to alleviate disease symptoms, but it's a bit hit and miss.
Yes.
There's a lot of challenges associated with delivery. But as you mentioned, the kind of the genetic engineering-based approach, like there's actually in GATTACA, there's a deleted scene from the scene where Vincent's parents are coming together to select Anton as the kind of the worthy son, and they're in the geneticist office talking about this, and if for an extra, I think it's $5,000 in the film, then the geneticist says, we can try and edit in some additional traits for, say, enhanced mathematical or musical ability or something to that effect, right? And they're like, oh man, I don't think we can afford an extra $5,000. But so the possibility of offering that genetic engineering of specific alterations is kind of is acknowledged in the movie, or would have been if they kept it in, kind of thing. So it's a bit of they left it a bit more open and didn't explicitly talk about genetic engineering, but rather just embryo selection in the final cut. I'm not sure what motivated the decision to cut that bit out, but it was there in one of the deleted scenes bits.
Yeah, but I think it's I guess sort of I understand in a way. But then again, they cut it out. But I think there's a scene later on when Vincent and Irene go to a concert, right? And they're talking about they're going like piano concert. And though Vincent doesn't have a clue what's happening, Irene tells him that piece that the person was playing, actually, he has 12 fingers, because he throws the glove towards them and they catch it, and the glove has 12 fingers in, right? And he's like, oh, okay. And Irene explains to him that actually the piece he played was actually not playable by a normal person. It was designed, it was written for a person to have 12 fingers, right? So it's that idea that, like, they can do extra things, like extra finger or something, right?
So I think that actually this is actually an interesting place to bring up something in the illogic of the current regulation for things like genetically modified organisms in food crops. Right? Because I think it relates. So you could get 12 fingers by chance. You could get that from a random event if you looked hard enough. Right? You don't necessarily have to have engineered that. And this is so one of the things that is weird and inconsistent in the UK, the EU, like policy on crop genetic engineering or crop genetically modified crops, is that you can do radiation-based mutagenesis and then select for characteristics that are favorable in your crops, right? So you can take some crops, you can irradiate them, making a whole bunch of random genetic changes, and then select from them the ones that have the traits that you want. And you have no real knowledge or understanding of what all the other changes that you likely introduced whilst irradiating that plant will do to the plant. It's normally perfectly safe. However, you cannot do the same thing where you use a targeted genetic engineering technology to introduce a specific change that you want to make, that you might be able to find if you try hard enough by randomly irradiating plants and filtering it out. But you can't use a targeted method to introduce that change that will likely have fewer secondary changes.
But where's those laws, in Europe or America?
I think it's an EU thing, yeah.
But I mean, like for example, the purple tomatoes, like for example, those that have extra, what's the name? Thiamine? No, I don't remember the name of the compound, but that compound is necessary for like extra vitamins, right? Or the golden rice that's often used to like has extra vitamins, vitamin D, vitamin C, I think, or vitamin B. I don't remember.
A, I think, is the main one that's the problem.
The idea is that to provide extra vitamins for populations where there's a hunger, right? There's a hunger issue. So it makes no sense that there's those regulations that don't allow it, where you could, I mean, if you do selective breeding, that's already genetic modification, right? If you compared fruits and vegetables that were like 100 years ago, like tomatoes, or they were tiny, right? Those crops were like, that's why we did all that selective breeding. We picked those crops that were giving better yield, they were stronger, more resistant, right? We introduced those changes by selective breeding. Now they're completely different to what they were in 100 years ago, 200 years ago, etc. Right? That's already sort of a genetic engineering by selective breeding. So why can't we introduce the genetic engineering in the further step to even increase the yield, that like we could, for example, have less requirement for less land to be used because the crops we have even higher yield. Instead, we could, for example, utilize that land for growing trees to repopulate the create national parks and stuff like that. Like we bring the ecosystem back to what it originally was.
Yeah. And there's a lot of this kind of like badly conceived and ignorantly constructed legislation in the regulation of genetically modified organisms, primarily for like food consumption purposes, where particularly the one where it's the one that makes least sense is the one that I described, where you can randomly mutate, but you can't targetedly mutate.
We randomly mutated it, and it just happened to be this genetic mutation. Well, what a surprise!
Yeah, that's that just is completely logically inconsistent. But I think that to bring it back around to the discussion of human genetic modification, like the fact that the GMO regulations for food plants and so on are so screwed up and just generally idiotic in various ways around the world and have all kinds of serious political misunderstandings associated with them, is why people are so cautious about doing it in humans. There's a lot of effort being put into place to try and say, let's take it carefully, let's agree what kind of legislative framework we want to operate within in order to do this, so that we don't end up with the same mess that is costing people their lives in terms of like food supply problems and wasting huge quantities of food unnecessarily because of the bad regulatory situation around GMOs. Let's not have that same situation occur when it comes to human genetic modifications, so that people suffer unnecessarily because of ill-conceived legislation. And that's where the first kind of genetically engineered human children have already been born, and everyone was very upset about that, because everyone was trying to be very careful about the way that we did this, so that we didn't end up in the same mess we're in over like crop GMOs. So I think that it's worth discussing the genetic engineering technology a little bit before we dive into that. So we've talked about this kind of selecting from many possible genomes to get the one you're interested in that have the particular genetic traits. But it would in some ways be a lot easier if you could copy and paste particular bits of the genome that have the sequence that you want, or the sequence that has this favorable characteristic associated with it, from one genome and put it in the one that you're interested in. Right? Genetic engineering. That's actually taking some piece of genome sequence and altering it, rather than just selecting among the ones that exist. And this used to be quite a difficult thing to do. It still is in some ways, but it's gotten a lot easier since 2012. The previous technologies that existed to do this were not particularly exact about where they would insert the sequence. You kind of had okay, we can cut a sequence out from a place and then we can paste it
roughly
somewhere.
Yeah, it was the it's still used nowadays. It was for mouse breeding, where they put like this locks, they were called locks, sequences where hopefully they would be swapped, right? Or somewhere around those areas would be inserted, but they were not really accurate.
You usually end up having to kind of screen, so you look for an insertion that happens to have been at kind of a space that's not going to break anything else, that also has the thing that you want inserted somewhere, right? And you go through a whole bunch of possible organisms and say, okay, this one has worked in a way that's probably not going to do any damage. Right? So you have the cut function in your word processor, but when you paste, it randomly picks a spot to stick the paragraph you are interested in copying and pasting. So it's not particularly useful yet. Right? And then so we started to develop the technology to target it more exactly with things like talons and zinc finger nucleases, which are proteins that will go to a particular location in the genome and cut at that spot based on the sequence. But the problem is that they're difficult and expensive to make to target a particular sequence. So, like, knowing that you want to make a cut in this particular area so that you can insert something, you have to spend a lot of time engineering a protein that's kind of specific to that sequence that will go there and cut that, and it's expensive to do.
So idea was like to have something, a protein that can do it, but you provided like a template to do the cutting.
Well, I mean, that wasn't even like an idea as such, but that was like the yes. pipe dream, right? That was the thing that we would, like, if there was a protein that would let us target this stuff, exactly, that would be awesome. But no one was actually, like, the discovery of the technology that we now have to do this, CRISPR, was serendipitous. We weren't looking for a protein that could do that when CRISPR was discovered. The sort of first, like, early discovery of CRISPR, which, by the way, CRISPR stands for Clustered Regularly Interspersed Short Palindromic Repeats. Bit of a mouthful, hence the acronym. But it refers to the pattern in the sequences that the guy who initially discovered this, a chap called Francisco Mojica, observed in bacteria. It was initially found in bacteria. And it was these clusters, so groups of these features that were spaced at regular intervals, regularly interspersed from one another, in these bacterial genomes, and they had these palindromic regions. So that's like Hannah, it's the same forward as backward. So these little flanking regions that were the same forward as backward on either side of these little repeat things, and then repeats. There were several of them. That's where the name comes from. But so there's this weird sequence that was found in bacteria. It has this strange pattern. What's it do was kind of the question. Nobody really knew what they were for, but there was this observation, and this Francisco Mojica researcher, this guy from Spain, kind of, he latched onto this weird thing and was kind of trying to figure out what this sequence feature was, and eventually in 2005 figured out that it was like an innate immunity, an adaptive immunity system in bacteria. So bacteria are attacked by viruses, like the rest of us. Especially this year and the year before. So like everyone else, viruses screw over the bacteria too. The bacteriophages is the name for viruses that attack bacteria. And so what this system did was it allowed bacteria to store a chunk of sequence from a virus in its genome and recognize it. So if a virus that matched one of these repeats attacked a bacteria, it could make a protein that would make a copy of that sequence in RNA from the DNA, go and find it in the genome of the virus, and cut up the genome of the virus. So this is an adaptive immunity system, right? So if a bacteria happens to survive a viral infection, it can take a sample of its genome, keep it in its genome, and then whenever it sees that again, it can go and attack it. That's the adaptive immunity system of CRISPR. And the sort of basics of that tool, the system, the protein that holds this guide RNA, this RNA that matches the sequence in the virus, is called a CRISPR-associated protein, Cas9. It was the 9th one they happened to find. So that's where the name comes from. You often hear CRISPR-Cas9. Cas9 is a protein that does this cutting function and uses this guide RNA as a lookup. So the thing that this gave us, and that was demonstrated in 2012 by Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier, was that you could take an arbitrary guide RNA, a piece of sequence that was more or less, there's a couple of minor constraints on what the sequence can be, but not much that really matters, and arbitrarily target a protein to anywhere in the genome where you wanted to make a cut.
Yep.
So now you didn't have to spend years engineering, or a long time engineering, a specific expensive protein to go and make a cut at a particular location. You could go and make a cut by just creating a guide RNA sequence and putting in the Cas9 protein at the same time. Much easier, much more flexible. I've done this myself in the lab for doing targeted mutagenesis with CRISPR-Cas9. It's a relatively straightforward thing to do. Certainly by comparison with like designing proteins.
Honestly,
right?
it's so much easier, and nowadays a lot of people use it almost all the time, because developing a guide RNA is not difficult. We've had this technology for a long time, designing primers for example, polymerase chain reactions. All those things were just readily available. We just needed the appropriate system that would utilize it, and now everybody uses that system because it's so much easier to use, and you can do a change to a single nucleotide within the genome.
And it offers a really really powerful tool for doing genetic engineering. So, I mean, the first thing that you can do with it is you can just make a cut, and then like the cell will try and repair when its DNA is broken. Usually speaking, though, it uses something called non-homologous end joining. So if you go in and make a snip in the DNA, it kind of just sticks the ends back together, and it's a little bit of a kludge. Doesn't necessarily check that the sequence is correct. So you often get small insertions or deletions that can inactivate a particular gene. So that's kind of like the crudest way you can use this, to just kind of turn a gene off by mutating it in such a way that it gets broken. But you can also use you can target like a couple of different locations. Let's say you want to take a whole gene and replace it with a different gene with a number of different alterations in it. You could say cut in 2 places, flanking the gene on either side of it, and then you provide a template, a version of the gene that you want to be inserted into the genome that has some matching sequences on either side. So it's like the same sequence on either side of the sequence you want to insert that are flanking the gene that you just cut out. So then there's some cellular machinery that does more sophisticated repairs for something called homologous recombination. So it will take, like if you've got a badly damaged piece of DNA, where there's some double strand breaks where it's been cut in one of your genes, you have 2 copies of all the genes. So this machinery is set up so that it can take the functional copy of the gene, the one that's not been damaged, make a copy of it and sort of replace the broken version. So you can hijack that machinery to insert the sequence that you want to insert into the genome, but you have to persuade it to do the homologous recombination and not the non-homologous end joining. And it's another one of those things where it's a bit of a low frequency event to actually successfully do the insertion of a new sequence. So there's still some kind of improvements to be made in the way that we do those kind of edits. But that's the kind of underlying technology that now means that we have much more control over.
Well, we can do the genetic modifications. It's honestly the discovery and usage of CRISPR-Cas9 system has made the genetic modification technology progress so much faster, and
it was extraordinarily rapid, the adoption, right? It was the proof of principle was 2012
now 2021. Pretty much almost everyone uses it. It's
I was using it in a lab project in 2016.
I remember that when I went to university in 2012, that's when I went first biochemistry, and then when we were introduced to it 2013 or 14 even, actually, it already, there was already specific professor who was talking about exactly the evolution of the system, Cas5 and whatever, the first iterations of the proteins they used. It was already very well described, very well characterized, and basically everyone was talking about it. It was the big next thing. So yes, that's the thing that that's what probably will be used, or at least it's another iteration of the same system, probably even more efficient, that is going to be used next stages, or at the point where GATTACA is taking place, right?
Yes, it's a likely candidate that kind of brings forward the possible reality of the kind of genetic engineering they were suggesting in that deleted scene. And in fact, it more or less brought that into reality already, because there are 2, I think there are probably now 3 CRISPR children, possibly more. So there was this kind of rogue Chinese scientist who was, he wasn't a rogue before he did this, but he became a slightly rogue Chinese scientist. His name was Hui Jiankui. My pronunciation of Chinese names is probably terrible, so take that with a pinch of salt. But he was a fertility specialist at the Southern University of Science and Technology in Guangdong province, and he, without sort of adequate medical consent, as far as we can tell, genetically engineered 2 twin girls named Lulu and Nana, who were born on the 28th of November in 2018. And he announced this at a conference presentation without a great deal of detail about what exactly he'd done. And unfortunately, the choice of genetic engineering that he did was not, people might have been more sympathetic if he'd intervened in something that was as severe as say, tay-sachs, right? Some kind of a disease where you have this very high risk
Yes.
situation that but that wasn't where he chose for some reason to intervene. He actually took a slightly crude approach and used that inactivation method that I described for CRISPR, where you just kind of target a spot to delete something and inactivate a protein, to inactivate a protein called CCR5, which is associated with immune function. And there are particular variants of CCR5 that are known to make people resistant to HIV infection. However, he didn't even sort of like put in the known resistance variant. He just deleted or inactivated the protein, which is has other functions, right?
I mean,
there's a possibility that these girls might
are
be
designed for. Like, they came out to use for specific functions. So he just went ahead and just did it for just randomness.
Well, his intention was to confer HIV resistance.
Yes, but was there any
and I think that it would
susceptibility
successfully
that those kids would have HIV?
So that's the thing that's also not particularly sensible about the choice of scenario here, because their father apparently had HIV, but it's fairly unlikely that you will transmit that
It's higher
to your
chance if it
kids.
was a mother then, so it made more sense if it was a mother.
Exactly. Right. So that, like, the mother could transfer it through bodily fluids during the process of giving birth, right? That there's a higher risk there. But for the father, right, as long as you're not like bleeding in your children's mouths on a regular basis, you're not terribly likely to transmit it to them, right? It's you can take basic precautions and have a pretty safe bet that that's not going to be transmitted. But apparently the stigma on HIV infection is still relatively high in China. But yeah, and inactivating CCR5 may potentially lead to an increased risk of infection from flu and other viruses. So yeah, like all around kind of bad choice of the first attempt to do this human genetic engineering for the first time. Outside of adequate consent procedures, not properly approved, not part of a proper study. A technically not particularly great intervention for a problem that didn't even really need solving in the first place. It's it was kind of not a good way for the first human genetic engineering to take place.
Like, I think it's often related to the fact that people want to be the first, the pioneers who risked to do something like this, and it always fills me with a anger of power of thousands of suns. It's just like, there is this possibility, and we know we cannot fuck it up because the whole world is looking in our hands, and we know the history, and we know things that happened before, and yet there are dumb people like that who do this stuff, and it's just, it annoys me. I'm angry.
Yeah,
I'm absolutely furious.
And actually, there's a third child that he had edited. We don't know as much, I think, about the situation there. But yeah, so once he was, I think, sanctioned
He was
by the Chinese government. And there was a while where people didn't know where he was.
I think he probably went into hiding, and then he probably was discovered and then interrogated by the Chinese authorities, and then probably the whole thing came out, and that's why it's just...
As I wouldn't care to speculate what exactly went on there.
But I would say, honestly, he should be hung by his...
He's ended up with, I think he had some kind of fairly, he was not actually like struck off the medical register. He was just banned from doing fertility treatments again. I think he might have had some kind of minor like criminal prosecution where he had, I forget, I don't know the details of the case. But I think he has since been able to return to medical practice in some sense, but not as involved in anything related to this research. So he's not like completely he's like retained some kind of a career as at least as a physician, if not in research anymore to a significant degree. But yeah,
I need to say but there's one thing that I wanted to like briefly touch upon, just very briefly, was the fact that there were so many rockets flying off in Gattaca, almost like 12 a day or something, as you mentioned. And it's just like, we're almost quite near that idea, though. Because I guess I assume those rockets have to be reusable, because if you have one-way rockets, I don't think there's enough resources to have enough of all of those, materials to just go off into space. But we are getting there slowly. That with the reusable rockets, that they can land properly, and so that's one other thing that Gattaca predicted, but we're slowly getting there.
Yeah, I mean, everyone thought that would happen probably sooner than it ended up being after the space race, right?
I mean, but that's the thing, like, space race happened, and then it went down because there was no more, there was no more race, right? There was nothing, and it was quite expensive. And then we realized, actually, the fact that we are messing up this planet quite a lot. Maybe some of us will want to escape, so that's why people start pushing towards it.
Well, yeah, it is let's not get on too much of a tangent at this point.
I just thought that it's interesting because it was something that I would say a lot of space enthusiasts are always observing, and honestly, the recent landing on Mars and the fact that there are people out there who invested money and resources to try to achieve this dream is something that I really admire, and it's something that I'm looking forward to see what's next.
Mm-hmm. And it remained the aspiration in this film, right? The promise of space travel, the desire to get up there and out into the heavens, was core motivation for our main character, right? The desire to get out there in space. Well, apparently, wearing a suit.
Yeah, I mean, that's a bit unrealistic, let's be honest. We all know that's not possible to do that, especially with the acceleration and the forces on your body. You need a special suit for that. And plus the radiation.
It depends, but yeah. I mean, it's. I did wonder if it might be a little bit of a commentary on. So one of the things we didn't really discuss was that, like, if Vincent actually has a heart defect, that means he might drop over dead of a heart attack at any moment. Like, that's a legitimate concern for the astronaut crew.
I mean, yes, absolutely.
Right?
I mean, it's your heart has to be functioning properly, because in the pressure to pump the blood around your body and stuff like that. Yeah, I feel like that's a pretty serious concern, and there's a reason why those things are excluded.
And yeah, so if you have a critical function to play on the team, and you might drop over dead at any moment, then that's a problem for everyone else. But I was wondering a little bit if the fact that when they go up in the spacecraft at the end, they're all wearing their 3-piece suits. Well, not 3-piece, but their fancy suits. And not, kind of protective gear. If that was maybe some kind of commentary on how routine space travel has become, that they actually don't need to be as concerned about some of this stuff as they are. But I mean, it does seem like it is actually still quite a risky mission, right? Going, it's a year-long thing all the way out to Titan. It's a long way away. It seems like the crew would still be dependent on him, even if he didn't.
Yeah, I mean, yes, obviously the crew would be used, of course. He calculated the trajectory as well and stuff like that, and obviously they're all walking in suits and everything, but how about all the luggage and everything they need to it feels to me that it's pretty simplistically put out there that but maybe it is just you give your luggage away and then just sit down and enjoy the journey in 100 to 100 years, who knows. And we'll see. But I wanted to point out that earlier on, at the very beginning of the episode, we mentioned, I mentioned the description of what the movie was, the cyber sort of punk idea of dystopian future. And in fact, Gattaca is used as an example of transhumanism, which is not part of eugenics, but it sort of relates to it by the fact that it's a movement that advocates of an enhancement of human condition by developing and making available sophisticated technologies that will enhance, lifespan, mood, or cognitive abilities, right? And this is what we tackled in the cyberpunk episode quite a lot. So I don't want to go into much of the detail into it, but it is something that being able to modify your body. In Gattaca case, there's not much of technology being used instead of body part, body itself, but And here, it's still part of this sort of enhancing your body to be faster, stronger, smarter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's taking an exclusively biotechnological approach, right? It's all about the genetic engineering, not about the the kind of cyborg type enhancements.
It probably hits closer to xenogenesis than cyberpunk.
A little bit, yeah.
Considering,
But I suspect that our future will probably feature some of both.
As always, it's going to be probably both of the worlds, right? Combination of both things.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think the movie is great. There are some things, as we pointed out, that didn't exactly match. The printing out of the sequences, the 4-stage embryo being used for checking the sequences.
Yeah, so I think it presents a valuable starting point to have a discussion about these kind of bioethical considerations, and it presents a warning about paying too much attention to the genetic determinist kind of attitude, right? The reality is not genetic determinism. The reality is like the genetics modifies the probabilities. It doesn't make things determined. It makes things more or less likely.
The importance of the environment, the nurturing environment, and the idea is that I think also the fact that your determination is able to overcome the issues.
I mean, the tagline of there is no gene for the human spirit is it's clearly part of the message of the film is the determination, and of course the issue of kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure, as it were, right? If you have poor genetics, then you may not be treated in such a fashion as to develop to your greatest potential. And then at the same time, if you have spectacular genetics, it may weigh on you so much that you don't live up to your potential, or you fail to try hard enough to really push to those limits. But I think it's an area where we need more kind of public conversation about these issues of bioethics. And how we're going to proceed from a regulatory perspective, because I mean we've got these kind of things like the incidents of this happening with this case with He Jiankui, and like there's a lot of good that could be done with this technology and is already being done in pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and the like, but it's still like we need the framework in place to handle these things, and we need to get there as soon as possible, because the sooner we start implementing some of the technologies that many of which we already have the potential to do a lot of good with them, but we're not necessarily using them because of these bioethical concerns, right? And I think one of the reasons we see this kind of this stuff happening in China is China has a kind of less risk-averse attitude to some of this, the application of this technology, there's a reason why the European and American groups have been more reticent with this, because the religious lobbies in the US and the concerns over like mishandling the regulation in the way that's happened with genetically modified crops in Europe. So we're reticent to move on with it, but we need to have the conversation so that we can progress with it, because there's we're leaving stuff on the table that can help people if we don't put some effort into making that progress possible. That's one of those, like the discussion around a lot of these sort of complex bioethical issues of consent and so on. Sometimes it's painted as, it's a genuinely complicated issue, but sometimes it's painted as more complicated than it needs to be. Some of the ethical questions are relatively straightforward, right? If you can improve someone's health by intervening with germline genetic modification, I can't see any useful ethical objection to doing that.
No, absolutely. As long as we can improve our lives of others, it definitely should be considered as a positive thing. And the idea that somebody opposes this is, for me, is ridiculous.
I mean, the areas where it, for me, gets interesting and potentially morally difficult are questions around like shaping particular ability, right? So if it's just if it's a an improvement of health or even an enhancement of capability, but that's a general enhancement, and it's something that doesn't necessarily kind of direct you in a particular trajectory. It's not like, the analogy I've used before is like, marathon runners and sprinters, right? If I'm not picking for you to have the sprinter ability as opposed to the marathon runner ability, then, but I'm just making you like generically better at something, that makes reasonable sense to me. Where it starts to become, I think, a challenging issue in the question of consent is choices that push you in a particular direction, right? If I'm consciously choosing to make you a sprinter instead of a marathon runner, in terms of your natural aptitudes, then I'm taking away
freedom
certain
from the choice.
Well, it's the thing. It's not really like you're not taking away freedom of choice as such, but you're.
Well, I mean, if you determine
because
some person's...
it would have been decided by chance anyway, right? So it's the difference between a conscious choice and a random choice. In neither case did I have the freedom to choose that I had that aptitude, but someone else now does. So that becomes a slightly more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is that I think the big ethical question would be, giving the opportunity to people, right? Let's say your children, that you want them to be able to be better sprinters or marathon runners, whichever. But then the question is that the fact is that, as the case with Jerome, is that the expectations were on him. And often, parents guide their children, right? That's the whole idea. You're supposed to guide them. But the fact is that you should let children to pick what their interests are, right? And that freedom, you should support them and, guide them in a way, but not force them into things like that they are not interested in, right? And this is where I think the ethical issue becomes, like, a person can have all those genes that can make them amazing sprinter, but doesn't mean that they're interested in it.
Yeah. And then it becomes the question of trade-offs around, like, did you sacrifice their ability in any other areas to make them the ideal sprinter?
So,
and that's where it really starts to become a
exactly. So you could give them a bit edge to things, but doesn't mean that you should direct everything and cause, for example, determine what causes a fallback in other places, right?
Yeah, that's the thing. Where, especially in cases where there is a certain compromise, that's where I think it becomes a particularly difficult ethical question. But I say even if I could make you I'm not sure that it's a tricky one, right? Because if I could make you the perfect sprinter, but I can't, I don't have any control over whether or not you will want to be a professional sprinter. Is it a problem that you have the ability to be a perfect sprinter? Not unless it's affecting you negatively somewhere else, right? That's where that's how I tend to think of it.
I also think the fact is, this question is then it's like the earlier argument about the fact that the person may have those abilities, right? And then the idea of that is that, let's say somebody has the ability of this and the other person, let's say the lady has another, and then they, like, for example, pair up and they have children. The question is now then, do those children, like, there's an expectation, right? So did the child inherit this set of genes or this set of genes? How it's going to be in the future? What stress is going to be on them? The pressure that Jerome had when he in GATTACA. So there's a lot of questions that have to be answered, but questions that we don't probably know the answers to, because it's the fact that it's still the choice of a person. The question is, the child had the choice. No, it didn't, because it was choice of the parents. The child should have the choice of freedom, obviously, to pick. But then again, if
that's the thing, like, it's not possible in advance to consult the child about what they want to be.
And the fact is that, what if, for example, they have children, and those children, because of their, let's say, superior genes, if they can call them like that, in those areas, they go about and do what originally the purpose was of the original child, and they win. And it's like, does it give an advantage that those having those genes over other people who have not this, right? It obviously does. So what do we do next?
Oh yeah. But,
this is now the rabbit hole that we probably don't want to discuss.
But so for me though, I think it is it's unequivocally, like, anything that is an expansion of capability is a good thing.
Yeah, I would agree on that point. Anything that we can expand on abilities is a good thing.
it's kind of an extension of the concept of health, right? I mean, the notion of being in good health is kind of a fuzzy one because it's sort of a question of what is the norm for good health, right? If the norm for good health is, I can lift some fairly ordinarily sized weights versus I can lift a truck, right? Where the norm is for capability is set by what is presently the case. Right? So I adopt a transhumanist attitude towards this stuff and say that if we can improve our capabilities in certain dimensions, we should.
And I think also the fact that, I would say yes, I agree, but in the same time, the question is then, where do we draw the line in a way that it doesn't... Because, I mean, our generations, right, are getting taller and taller, for example, right? But that's just, a natural thing, humans over a period span have been getting taller, right? That's a natural thing, just like... So...
Largely for nutritional reasons.
But also, certain genetic factors, because, certain populations are much taller than the others, right? And so we could potentially get people getting even taller and taller because of the choice the parents made, like basketballers, like why don't we make them 3 meters tall?
That's the thing with all these capabilities, they ultimately end up being some kind of set of trade-offs, right?
The fact is that the question is then what happens next, right? Like, then do we basically create something equivalent of superheroes, of superhumans, where we have people who have, as you said, can lift a truck with, like just like that. Question: what happens at that point?
I say if it's I say that's probably not a great example because it's not terribly useful.
Well, the thing is,
right?
It doesn't matter if it's terribly useful or not. The choice is there. If there's a possibility to have something, there's gonna be someone out of 7 or 8 billion nowadays of people will want to have that the ability, right? So it's not that it's very useful. It's the question is, if somebody is out there who wants it and has the funds to, and they go ahead with it, what happens next? Obviously, we're not anywhere near to get those levels, right? So it's...
Oh, yeah. That's it's extrapolating
we're extrapolating like quite far in future, but I'm just saying is that at some point in, I don't know, 100 years or more, let's say, I hope, that when these choices are available, there is this very clear boundary on what things can be and shouldn't be done.
I think we will have to, in all likelihood, get much more comfortable with the idea of considerably greater diversity of humanity in dimensions that we're not accustomed to having a great deal of diversity in.
Absolutely agree.
Because I think people will pursue all kinds of weird and wonderful directions with genetic engineering of their kids.
I think we'll possibly in several centuries or millennia we'll end up like with the xenogenesis oncally, basically developing things that are beyond our comprehensions. People who can withstand long journeys, interstellar journeys, or stuff like that. So it's going to be interesting aspect, and
it presents a profound political challenge because we're prone to getting into conflicts over trivial and imagined differences between people that we have now. And we now have a technological capability that will, before too much longer, give us the ability to create more diversity along more dimensions than we have previously had. So it's a definite potential source of conflict. But as my personal opinion on it is that we shouldn't attempt overmuch to limit exploration in that space. Right? I mean, we want to regulate for safety. We want to regulate for effectiveness and for quality and for all those things. But I think that we should still permit people a great deal of freedom of choice of what they choose to do when it comes to genetic engineering.
Let's see what's going to happen. We're still far off, but I'm looking forward to it.
Well, as a biologist, I'm fond of the whole, create some variation and have some selection, not of the red in tooth and claw kind, but of the more kind of social kind. What happens to work out as a good way of organizing a civilization and so on. It's we get all kinds of innovation from doing stuff that's novel and unexpected and permitting
things that we haven't even considered before. Yeah,
exactly. Permitting experimentation,
expanding our horizons of things that we can potentially do.
Exactly.
I guess, and on this point, I guess we should finish. Yeah,
I think so. Yeah,
it's been a long one, and I think, but it's a really good discussion. And for all the things we discussed, I think it points out how great GATTACA movie is, as a movie is, and how we discussed all the biology that was there in proper depth, especially the sequencing and gene modifications. But as always, you can find all the places we upload our podcasts on our website, xenothesis.com. I was Michael Glinka.
I was Rich Naxon.
Thank you for listening. Bye.
Goodbye.